Let's take a deep breath, relax, and slowly explore the story of India. In the year 1863, a geologist named Robert Bruce Foote was walking through the red earth near a small village in southern India, not far from the coast. He worked for the Geological Survey, and his job was simple enough: to map the rocks and minerals of the land. He was not looking for anything ancient. He was looking for stones. But what he found, half buried in the reddish soil beside a river, was a crude tool, chipped and shaped by hands that had held it perhaps 1,000,000 years before. It was the first stone hand axe ever found in India, and it would quietly begin to rewrite the story of how human beings spread across the earth. Foote could not have understood what he held. The science of human origins barely existed at that time. But the tool was a message from an almost unimaginably distant past, a sign that the land we now call India had been home to thinking, tool-making beings for far longer than anyone had dreamed. Modern dating methods have since confirmed what that discovery hinted at. Those stone tools are at least 1,000,000 years old, and possibly closer to 1.5 million. They were made by an early human ancestor, the same kind of being who first walked out of Africa nearly 2 million years ago. India, it turns out, is one of the oldest places on Earth where humans have lived outside of Africa. And when you consider the geography, this begins to make sense. India is not simply a country. It is a vast triangular peninsula, nearly the size of all of Western Europe, bordered on the north by the tallest mountains on the planet, and on the south by the warm waters of the Indian Ocean. Between these two extremes lies an extraordinary range of landscapes. There are snow-fed rivers winding through immense plains. There are scorching deserts and dense tropical forests. There are high plateaus and lush green river deltas. Each of these places offered something different to the early humans who wandered into them. A different kind of food, a different kind of shelter, a different way to survive. The rivers were especially important. The Indus, the Ganges, the Narmada, the Godavari, the Krishna, and many others. These are not just lines on a map. They are the arteries along which Indian life has flowed for as long as there have been people here. It was in the Narmada Valley, in central India, that one of the most significant early human fossils on the subcontinent was discovered. In 1982, archaeologists found a fragment of a skull, roughly 500,000 years old, belonging to an early human. It was physical proof of the beings who had made those ancient tools. But the story does not end with these early ancestors. Modern humans, people like you and me, arrived much later. The best evidence suggests that most of the ancestry of the people living in India today traces back to a great migration out of Africa, roughly 50,000 years ago. These travelers likely followed the coastline, moving eastward along the southern edge of Arabia until they reached the subcontinent. They were not the first humans here, but they were the ones whose descendants would stay. Now, can you picture what happened next, over many thousands of years? As the last great ice age ended and the world grew warmer, these early people began the slow, quiet shift from wandering and hunting to settling down and growing food. The earliest evidence of this change comes from a place called Mehrgarh, in the mountain passes of what is now Pakistan. Discovered in 1974, Mehrgarh is one of the oldest farming settlements in the world, dating to about 9,000 years ago. Its people grew wheat and barley, kept cattle and sheep, and lived in small mud brick houses. They made tiny figurines and eventually learned to work with clay to create pottery. They even practiced something that looks remarkably like early dentistry, drilling into teeth with tiny stone tools, a detail that still surprises scientists today. But perhaps the most beautiful window into this ancient world comes from the rock shelters of Bhimbetka in the hills of central India. Discovered in 1957 by an archaeologist who spotted the rock formations from a passing train, the site contains hundreds of shelters, many of them covered with paintings that span thousands of years. The earliest images, perhaps 12,000 years old, show animals and hunting scenes in red and white, made from natural pigments found in the soil. Later paintings show people riding horses, dancing together, and living in small communities. These are not just pictures. They are the thoughts and dreams of people whose names we will never know, preserved on stone walls in the heart of India. And through all of this, there was the monsoon. That great annual cycle of wind and rain that still governs life across the subcontinent was already shaping these early communities. The monsoon brings torrential rain from the southwest between June and September, turning dry, cracked earth into lush green abundance. For the earliest people here, the monsoon was everything. It was the difference between a good year and a terrible one, between enough food and not nearly enough. Learning to read its signs, to store water, to plan for the dry months. These were the skills that would eventually lead to something much greater. By about 7,000 years ago, the scattered farming villages of the northwest were growing larger and more connected. Trade routes began to link highland settlements with the fertile lowlands near the Indus River. Pottery styles became similar across wider areas, a sign that people were talking to one another, exchanging ideas and goods. And in the rich, silty plains where the Indus and its many branches deposited fresh soil each year, the conditions were gathering for one of the most remarkable achievements in all of human history: the creation of a civilization whose cities would have running water and covered drains thousands of years before anything similar appeared in Europe. The story of India begins long before India existed as an idea. It begins with a stone tool dropped beside a river in the south, with the footprints of early humans in the Narmada Valley, with painted dreams on the cave walls of the Vindhya Hills, and with the first seeds of wheat pressed into the soil of Mehrgarh. By the time the great cities of the Indus rose from the plains, the subcontinent had already been home to human beings for over 1,000,000 years. And what happened next, in those cities beside the river, is a story that was lost for 4,000 years, waiting to be found again. In 1856, 2 British engineers were building a railway line across the Punjab, and they needed ballast, the crushed stone that goes beneath the tracks. The local workers pointed them to a nearby mound full of old bricks. Thousands of those bricks were hauled away and laid under the iron rails, and nobody thought much of it. It would be decades before anyone realized that those bricks had been fired and shaped by master builders 4,000 years ago, and that the mound being torn apart so carelessly was one of the great cities of a civilization the world had completely forgotten. The city was called Harappa, and it belonged to what we now call the Indus Valley Civilization, one of the 3 great Bronze Age cultures of the ancient world, alongside Egypt and Mesopotamia. But while the pyramids of Egypt and the temples of Mesopotamia had never been lost to memory, the cities of the Indus had vanished so thoroughly that until the 1920s, no one even knew they had existed. Their rediscovery is one of the most remarkable stories in the history of archaeology. When serious digging began at Harappa, and at another great site called Mohenjo-Daro, what the archaeologists found stunned the world. These were not rough settlements. They were fully planned cities, laid out on a careful grid, with wide main streets crossing at right angles and smaller lanes branching off for privacy. The houses were built from bricks of a standard size, always in the same proportions, and the cities covered enormous areas. At its peak, the Indus Valley Civilization stretched across more than 1,000,000 square kilometers, larger than Egypt and Mesopotamia combined. Over 1,000 cities and towns have been found, and the population may have reached 5 million people. But the most remarkable thing about these cities was something you might not expect. It was not their size or their wealth. It was their drains. The people of the Indus Valley built the world's first known urban sanitation system. Each home had its own well for fresh water, and wastewater flowed through covered channels beneath the streets. Even the smallest houses on the edges of the city appear to have been connected to this system. Can you picture that for a moment? Thousands of years before anything similar was built in Europe, the people of the Indus Valley had running drains in every home, suggesting that cleanliness was not a privilege of the rich but a value shared by everyone. At Mohenjo-Daro, there was a great pool, roughly 12 meters long and more than 2 meters deep, carefully sealed to hold water. It was almost certainly used not for ordinary bathing, but for some kind of ritual cleansing, a practice that echoes in the traditions of India to this day. And at another site, called Dholavira, in one of the driest corners of Western India, the people carved 16 huge reservoirs inside their city, storing enough water to survive the long, rainless months. They built small dams and channels to catch and guide every drop of rainfall. In one of the most arid places on the subcontinent, they built a thriving city through the sheer cleverness of their water engineering. These people were also extraordinary traders. They used a system of standard weights, following a precise pattern that has been found at sites across the entire civilization, suggesting a unified system of measurement stretching across vast distances. They carved small square seals from a soft stone, decorated them with images of animals, and marked them with short inscriptions. These seals have turned up as far away as Mesopotamia, evidence that Indus merchants were trading with the great civilizations of the Middle East thousands of years ago. The most common image on the seals is a figure that looks like a bull with a single horn, sometimes called the unicorn. It was probably just a bull drawn from the side, with one horn hidden behind the other, but its true meaning remains a mystery. And that brings us to the deepest puzzle of all. The seals carry inscriptions in a writing system that no one has ever been able to read. About 400 different signs have been identified, but the average inscription is only 5 symbols long, and without some kind of key to unlock the code, the Indus script remains silent. A large prize has even been offered for anyone who can decipher it, a measure of both its importance and the frustration of decades of effort. We can see these people's cities, admire their engineering, and trace their trade routes across the ancient world. But we cannot read a single word they wrote. One recent discovery has given us something deeply personal, though. At a site called Rakhigarhi, the largest Indus Valley site in India, archaeologists found the remains of a woman who lived roughly 5,000 years ago. After years of careful work, scientists were able to read her genetic code. What they found was quietly remarkable. Her ancestry was a mixture of older local lineages, with no trace of the people from the grasslands of Central Asia who would later migrate into India. This means the cities were already old, already thriving, before those newcomers ever arrived. And there is something even more moving. The genetic thread that connects this woman, buried among her pottery in the plains of northern India, to the 1.5 billion people who live on the subcontinent today, is one of the longest unbroken lines of ancestry in all of human history. Yet for all the brilliance of their engineering, the reach of their trade, and the order of their civic life, the people of the Indus left behind no monuments to their kings, no temples boasting of their gods, and no inscriptions celebrating military conquests. We do not know the name of a single ruler, priest, or citizen. We do not know what language they spoke, what stories they told their children, or what they called their own cities. The civilization that once stretched across 1 million square kilometers is in the deepest sense still silent. And the question of why it fell silent, why the great cities were abandoned and their memory lost for 4,000 years, is where our story turns next. Sometime around 1900 years before the Common Era, a potter in the city of Mohenjo-Daro set down his tools for the last time. The evidence of his final days is still there in the ground. Unfinished pots, kilns that were never fired again, workshops slowly falling apart. He was not alone in leaving. Across the vast territory of the Indus Valley Civilization, the same quiet departure was happening. People were walking away from the cities that had thrived for 700 years. The carefully maintained drains were clogging with silt. The wide, planned streets were filling with rough shelters built by the last remaining inhabitants. The civilization was not destroyed in a single blow. It simply faded, like a fire slowly going out. The collapse of the Indus cities is one of the great mysteries of the ancient world. There is no dramatic story of an invading army breaking down the gates, no record of a decisive battle or a conquering king. The cities just emptied, and for over a century, scholars have been trying to understand why. The answer, as far as modern science can tell, lies mostly in the climate. Beginning around 2200 years before the Common Era, the monsoon began to weaken. That great annual pulse of rain that had watered the crops, filled the rivers, and made the whole civilization possible started to arrive less reliably and bring less water when it came. This was not a sudden disaster. It was a slow, grinding change that lasted centuries. The kind of shift that a single generation might barely notice, but that over time changes everything. The effect on the rivers was devastating. One of the major rivers that flowed through the eastern part of the civilization's territory, a river that some scholars connect to the legendary Saraswati River, mentioned in later texts, was not fed by distant glaciers like the Indus. It depended on the monsoon rains. As those rains weakened, this great river shrank from a flowing waterway to a seasonal trickle, and eventually to a dry channel that disappeared into the desert sand. Studies have documented severe and persistent droughts lasting from decades to centuries in the region during this period. When the rivers dried up, the foundation of the entire way of life collapsed. The cities had been built on the surplus food that reliable water made possible. Without that water, the harvests failed, the surpluses vanished, and there was no longer enough to support dense populations living in cities. But here is something worth knowing. The people did not simply die. They moved. The archaeological record shows a clear pattern of migration eastward toward the plains of the Ganges, where the monsoon remained stronger and more dependable. The great cities were left behind, but smaller farming villages multiplied in the east. The people survived, even as their civilization did not. And this was not just a shift from one place to another. It was a transformation in the way people lived. The standardized bricks, the uniform weights, the city-wide drains, all the things that had made the Indus cities so remarkable, disappeared. What replaced them was a simpler, more scattered way of life. The specialization and organization that had made urban living possible were gone. The long-distance trade networks fell apart. The system, whatever it was that had held this vast civilization together, simply came undone. Now, climate is not the only explanation that scholars have offered. Some have pointed to the shifting of the Earth itself, earthquakes and geological changes that may have diverted rivers away from cities that depended on them. Others have noted evidence of flooding at Mohenjo-Daro, where layers of silt suggest the city was repeatedly inundated. Disease, too, may have played a role. Dense city populations are always vulnerable to outbreaks in ways that scattered villages are not. And then there is the most debated question of all, the role of newcomers from the grasslands of Central Asia. For much of the 20th century, the common belief was that the Indus cities were destroyed by invading warriors who rode in on horses from the north. This idea was based partly on passages in later religious texts that described the destruction of walled cities, and partly on the assumption that the people who composed those texts were fundamentally different from the people of the Indus. Modern genetics has changed this picture dramatically. Careful study of ancient bones, including the woman from Rakhigarhi we spoke of earlier, has shown that there was indeed a significant movement of people from the Central Asian grasslands into the subcontinent. But it happened after the Indus cities had already declined, not during their peak. The woman who lived in the mature period of the civilization carried no trace of this Central Asian ancestry. The cities were already emptying before the newcomers arrived. The mixing of these populations was not sudden, but happened over many generations. Today, the genetic legacy of this ancient encounter is visible across India. People in the north carry more ancestry from the Central Asian migrants, while people in the south carry less, reflecting the geographic pattern of settlement. The newcomers brought with them a language that would evolve into Sanskrit, along with horses, new religious practices centered on fire, and a way of life quite different from the settled farming communities they encountered. What is beyond dispute is that the collapse of the Indus Valley Civilization marked the end of one of humanity's first great experiments in urban living. A civilization that had lasted 7 centuries, that had built cities with covered drains while most of the rest of the world lived in simple huts, that had traded with distant lands and maintained order across 1 million square kilometers, simply came apart. Its people survived, but their achievements were buried under the silt of dried rivers and the passage of 4,000 years. And yet, in the aftermath of this great fading, something new was stirring. The people moving into the plains of the Ganges, whether they were descendants of the Indus folk, migrants from the grasslands, or most likely a mixture of both, were beginning to compose hymns to gods of fire and storm and sky, chanted around flickering flames in the gathering dark. These hymns would become the oldest religious texts still spoken anywhere on earth. The age of the Vedas was about to begin. Imagine a night on the plains of the Punjab, perhaps 3,500 years ago. A fire crackles in the center of a clearing, and around it sit people in rough woolen clothes, their faces lit by the flickering glow. One of them begins to chant, and the others join in, their voices rising and falling in a rhythm that has been passed down from teacher to student for generations. The words are in an ancient form of the language we now call Sanskrit, and they are addressed to the god of fire, the divine messenger who carries human offerings up to the heavens. What these people are performing is not merely a prayer. It is in their understanding an act that sustains the very order of the universe. These hymns passed from mouth to mouth with extraordinary precision for centuries before anyone wrote them down, form the oldest of the 4 great collections known as the Vedas. Composed between roughly 1,500 and 1,200 years before the Common Era, this earliest collection contains over 1,000 poems arranged in 10 books. Its oldest portions are hymns of praise to the gods, descriptions of elaborate fire ceremonies, and reflections on the nature of existence. They reveal a society in transition, a people settling into a new land, and making sense of the world through poetry and ritual. The world these hymns describe was very different from the one that had come before. Where the Indus Valley people had been city dwellers with standardized bricks and covered drains, the early Vedic people were herders who lived in small villages and measured their wealth in cattle. The ancient word for war in their language literally means searching for cows, and the hymns are filled with references to cattle raids, tribal disputes, and the open, pastoral life of the plains. The horse, which does not seem to have been known to the Indus Valley people, was central to this new culture, pulling light chariots into battle and serving as a powerful symbol of royal authority. The gods of these hymns were vivid and personal. The greatest among them was a mighty warrior who wielded the thunderbolt, drank vast quantities of a sacred intoxicating drink pressed from a plant whose identity is still debated, and led the other gods in battle against cosmic forces of chaos. The fire god was the go-between, the one who carried offerings from the human world to the divine, present in every hearth and every sacred flame. There was a guardian of cosmic order, a sun god, a wind god, a goddess of the dawn. These were not distant, abstract ideas. They were forces that the Vedic people encountered every day in the sky, the storms, and the turning seasons. The religious life of these early communities centered on the fire sacrifice, complex ceremonies, for which the hymns were originally composed, involved offerings of food, clarified butter, grain, and that sacred drink, all given to the flames. The priests who performed these rituals gradually gathered enormous social authority, claiming a special connection to the divine. This growing priestly power would eventually harden into something more rigid, the foundation of a social hierarchy that would shape Indian life for thousands of years. The language these priests used was Sanskrit, and it is a language with remarkable connections to the wider world. The Sanskrit word for father sounds very much like the Latin word, and both sound like the English word. The word for three echoes across Latin, Greek, and many European languages. These similarities are not coincidence. They are traces of a deep historical relationship stretching back to a common ancestor language spoken thousands of years ago, linking the Vedic people to the other families of languages that spread across Europe and Asia. But Sanskrit was far more than a language for religious chants. As the centuries passed, roughly from 1,000 to 600 years before the Common Era, the focus of thought and inquiry shifted in a remarkable way. The priests and thinkers of this later period began to turn their attention away from the external rituals of the fire altar and inward, toward the nature of the mind and the self. This inward turn produced a collection of texts that rank among the most extraordinary achievements of the ancient world. These later texts ask questions that had perhaps never been asked quite so clearly before. What is the deepest nature of reality? What is the relationship between the individual soul and the consciousness that pervades everything? Is the world we see with our eyes truly real, or is it something more like a dream? The thinkers behind these questions argued that behind the endless variety of the visible world lies a single, unchanging truth, and that the individual self is, in its deepest essence, identical with that truth. One famous teaching from this tradition can be summed up in a few quiet words, meaning roughly, you are that. The idea that the deepest reality of the universe is not separate from the person wondering about it, but is in fact the same thing. The social structure of this later period was growing more layered and rigid. The idea of dividing society into four broad groups begins to appear in the later portions of the hymns. From the mouth of a cosmic being came the priests and scholars. From the arms came the warriors and rulers. From the thighs came the merchants and farmers. And from the feet came the workers and servants. Many scholars believe this description was added to the hymns later, as a way of justifying an order that was already taking shape in the real world. The system was probably more flexible in those early days than it would later become. The truly rigid, inherited caste structure that would define so much of Indian social life was a product of later centuries. But the seeds were planted here, and they proved extraordinarily lasting. This era also saw the beginning of a great eastward expansion into the plains of the Ganges, made possible by the arrival of iron. Iron axes could clear the thick forests of the river valleys, and iron-tipped plows could break the rich, heavy soil. Agriculture boomed, populations grew, and the center of Indian life began to shift from the dry northwest toward the lush, fertile east, a shift that would endure for the next 2,000 years. By the 6th century before the Common Era, the Vedic world had built a civilization of remarkable spiritual depth. The hymns it produced were preserved with such care that scholars today can reconstruct exactly how the language sounded 3,000 years ago. The philosophical questions it raised would echo through every later tradition of Indian thought, and the social structures it created, for better and for worse, would shape life on the subcontinent right up to the present day. But the very power of this system, the authority of the priests and the expense of their rituals, was about to provoke a challenge. In the growing cities of the Gangetic Plain, A new generation of seekers was preparing to question everything the Vedic world held sacred. Around 1,000 years before the Common Era, somewhere in the forests of the Upper Ganges Plain, a smith heated a lump of dark ore in a charcoal furnace until the metal inside began to separate from the rock. What came out was not the bright, soft copper or bronze that craftsmen had worked for centuries, but something harder, more durable, and infinitely more useful. It was iron, and its arrival in India would change everything. Iron technology came to India at the same time that people were pushing eastward from the Punjab into the fertile country between the Ganges and the Yamuna rivers, and then deeper into the middle and lower Ganges plain. The dense tropical forests that had kept this region wild and impenetrable could now be cut down with iron axes. The heavy, rich soil, far more productive than the drier earth of the northwest, could be broken open with iron-tipped plows. Farming expanded enormously, producing the surplus food that would support a new wave of city building and the rise of India's first kingdoms. The evidence of this transformation comes from the ground itself, in the form of a distinctive grey pottery decorated with black geometric patterns, found across the Upper Gangetic Plain at sites dating from roughly 1200 to 600 years before the Common Era. These sites show communities that were growing larger and more organized, with signs of rice farming, ironworking, and increasingly skilled craftsmanship. Some scholars have connected these places to the world described in the great Sanskrit epics, those sweeping stories of heroes, battles, and divine drama that would be told and retold for thousands of years, though such connections remain a matter of debate. By the 7th and 6th centuries before the Common Era, all this growth had produced something new on the political map. 16 great kingdoms and republics that stretched in a wide belt across northern India. These were not tiny villages or scattered tribes. They were real states, some of them monarchies ruled by ambitious kings, and others, rather remarkably, were republics governed by assemblies of elected leaders. One of these republics, centered on a city called Vaishali, in what is now the state of Bihar, practiced a form of collective decision-making that some historians consider one of the earliest examples of democratic governance anywhere in the world. The leading families of this republic met in assemblies where they debated policies and voted on important matters. The Buddha himself, who lived during this period, praised their system, saying that as long as they continued to meet together and make decisions as a group, they would prosper. This tradition of republican government, though it was eventually swallowed up by the expanding monarchies around it, was a quiet but remarkable experiment in human organization, one that appears to have come even before the famous democracy of ancient Athens. Among the monarchies, one kingdom gradually rose above all the others. Its name was Magadha, and its capital nestled among 5 protective hills in what is now Bihar, sat at the crossroads of important trade routes and near rich deposits of iron ore. The fertile soil produced abundant rice harvests, and the kingdom's position gave it great commercial wealth. Under a series of determined rulers, Magadha absorbed its neighbors one by one, growing steadily until, by the 5th century before the Common Era, it had become the dominant power in all of northern India. This period also brought a profound change in religious and philosophical life. The elaborate fire ceremonies described in the priestly manuals had become extraordinarily complex and expensive. Only the wealthiest patrons could afford them, and they required armies of specially trained priests whose ritual knowledge gave them enormous influence. The system, with its animal offerings and its claims of cosmic power, was beginning to make some thoughtful people deeply uncomfortable. It was in this atmosphere of material prosperity and growing spiritual questioning that the great inward-turning texts of Indian philosophy emerged. Composed between roughly 800 and 500 years before the Common Era, these philosophical dialogues represent a dramatic shift. Instead of looking outward to the fire altar and the rituals performed there, the great thinkers of this period looked inward, toward the practice of meditation and the direct experience of the deepest reality. They taught that true knowledge came not from performing ceremonies, but from a quiet, direct encounter with the unchanging truth behind all appearances. These thinkers also developed ideas that would become absolutely fundamental to Indian life. The concept that every action produces consequences that shape what happens in future lives, and the idea that all beings are caught in an endless cycle of death and rebirth, from which the ultimate goal is freedom. These were revolutionary notions that transformed how people understood their own existence. They provided a moral framework for everyday life, while simultaneously suggesting that the entire visible world, with all its joys and sorrows, was something to be ultimately transcended through wisdom and inner practice. The economic world was changing just as dramatically. The introduction of coins, probably in the 6th century before the Common Era, made buying and selling far easier across the growing kingdoms. The earliest Indian coins were small pieces of silver stamped with symbols of authority. Trade guilds began to organize merchants and craftspeople into professional groups that set standards, regulated prices, and spoke to the government on behalf of their members. Cities grew rapidly. The ancient city we now call Varanasi was already a bustling center of trade and learning. The capitals of the great kingdoms were large, walled places with markets, workshops, and public buildings. This second great wave of urban life in India, different from the earlier Indus Valley cities, but in its own way just as impressive, was built on iron, agriculture, and trade, and it would prove far more lasting than the first. By 500 years before the Common Era, the subcontinent was a world in ferment. Old certainties were being questioned by new ideas, new political structures, and powerful economic forces. In the forests and wandering communities of the Gangetic Plain, thinkers were asking the most fundamental questions a human being can ask, about the nature of suffering, the meaning of existence, and the possibility of true freedom. Two of them, a prince and a nobleman, would produce answers so compelling that they would transform not just India but the entire world. In the foothills of the Himalayas, in a garden in what is now southern Nepal, a child was born around 2,500 years ago to a queen and king of a small warrior clan. The boy was named Siddhartha, meaning one who has achieved his aim, and the stories that grew around his birth would eventually be told across half the world. A wise man examined the baby and declared that he would become either a great king or a great spiritual teacher. His father, wanting the boy to choose kingship, surrounded him with every comfort the palace could offer, shielding him from any sight of suffering, sickness, or death. The story of what happened next has become one of the most famous in all of human history. According to tradition, the young prince eventually ventured beyond the palace walls and saw, for the first time, an old man bent with age, a person wasted by illness, a lifeless body being carried to its final rest, and a wandering holy man with nothing but the clothes on his back and a look of deep peace in his eye. These four sights shattered his sheltered world and set him on a quest that would lead him to leave behind his wife, his newborn son, and his kingdom, all in search of an answer to a single question: why do people suffer, and how can suffering be ended? Now, Siddhartha's decision to walk away from everything was unusual, but it was not as strange as it might sound. The 6th century before the Common Era in India was a time of tremendous spiritual searching. The old rituals of the Vedic tradition, with their elaborate ceremonies and powerful priests, were being questioned by a growing movement of wandering seekers. Thousands of these seekers roamed the forests and riverbanks of the Gangetic Plain, living on whatever food was offered to them, practicing meditation, debating the nature of reality with anyone who would listen. They rejected the authority of the traditional priests and the ancient sacred texts, and they were searching, each in their own way, for something deeper. There were many reasons for this upheaval. The great fire sacrifices of the Vedic tradition had become fantastically expensive and elaborate, and the idea of killing animals for ritual purposes was beginning to trouble many thoughtful people. The rising merchant class, who were growing wealthy through trade but were shut out of the highest social status by the priestly hierarchy, were open to new teachings that challenged the existing order. And the growing cities of the Gangetic Plain, with their dense populations and complex social lives, had created a world where questions about meaning and purpose could be asked with a new kind of urgency. Siddhartha spent 6 years wandering as a homeless seeker, practicing extreme self-denial that nearly killed him, before concluding that starving the body was just as much a dead end as indulging it. He chose what he called the middle way, a path between the two extremes. And then he sat down beneath a fig tree at a place in what is now the state of Bihar. And there, after a night of deep meditation, he reached what his followers would call enlightenment, a complete understanding of the nature of suffering, its causes, and the way to its end. He was about 35 years old, and from that moment forward, he was known as the Buddha, which means simply the awakened one. His first teaching, given in a deer park near the ancient city of Varanasi, laid out the heart of his message. Life, he said, is marked by suffering. Suffering comes from craving and clinging to things that cannot last. But suffering can be ended, and the way to end it is a practical path of right understanding, right conduct, right effort, and right awareness. This was not a set of beliefs about gods or the afterlife. It was a method for transforming the mind, available to anyone regardless of birth or status. requiring no priests and no elaborate ceremonies. The Buddha spent the remaining 45 years of his life walking across the plains, teaching anyone who would listen, whether they were kings or outcasts, men or women, wealthy or desperately poor. He built a community of followers, both monks and ordinary people, and his last words, according to tradition, were a quiet reminder that all things pass and that each person must work out their own path with care. He was not the only great teacher of his age. His near contemporary, a nobleman named Vardhamana, known as Mahavira, meaning great hero, was born into a warrior family near the city of Vaishali. Like Siddhartha, he left his privileged life at the age of 30 to search for spiritual truth. But where the Buddha embraced a balanced middle path, Mahavira chose the most extreme form of self-discipline the Indian tradition had ever seen. For more than 12 years, he wandered without clothes through forests and towns, enduring hunger, cold, and the hostility of those who thought him mad, until he reached a state of perfect and complete knowledge. The heart of Mahavira's teaching was non-violence, taken to its furthest possible conclusion. Every living creature, from the largest animal to the smallest insect, possesses a soul that deserves respect and protection. His followers sweep the ground before their feet to avoid stepping on tiny creatures, and strain their drinking water to remove anything alive. This commitment to non-violence, extended not just to actions but to speech and even thought, has made Jainism one of the most ethically demanding paths in all of human religion. The impact of these two movements on India was immense. Buddhism spread rapidly among the growing urban population, and within a few centuries it had been carried by travelers and teachers to lands far beyond India. Jainism, though it never spread as widely, shaped Indian culture profoundly, especially in the west of the country, where Jain communities became some of the most successful merchants and traders on the subcontinent. Both movements challenged the old priestly order, not by attacking it directly, but by offering something different, a path to inner freedom available to everyone, regardless of birth. The old Vedic tradition did not disappear. It adapted, quietly absorbing some of the new ideas. The concept of non-violence, which had been central to Buddhism and Jainism, gradually became part of mainstream Hindu thought. The elaborate fire sacrifices gave way to simpler forms of worship. The priestly class retained its social standing, but had to share the spiritual landscape with these powerful new voices. This spiritual revolution of the 6th century, before the Common Era, changed India forever. It produced two of the world's great religions, reshaped the older tradition that already existed, and established a pattern of religious variety and philosophical questioning that would remain one of India's defining traits for the next 25 centuries. And soon, these new ideas would find their most powerful champion in an emperor whose journey from terrible violence to lasting peace would become one of the most extraordinary stories ever told. But first, a conqueror from the west would arrive at the borders of India, and his brief dramatic encounter with the subcontinent would set in motion a chain of events that would lead to the birth of India's first great empire. In the spring of 326 before the Common Era, Alexander of Macedon, having already conquered the vast Persian Empire and marched his army across the mountains of Afghanistan, stood on the western bank of a great river in the Punjab. On the far side waited a king named Porus, with an army that included something Alexander had never encountered before: 200 war elephants, each one a living fortress capable of crushing infantry and terrifying horses. The monsoon rains had swollen the river into a torrent, and Alexander's generals urged caution. But Alexander was not a cautious man. He had been marching and fighting for 8 years by this point. His army, a force of perhaps 40,000 soldiers, had battled its way across much of the known world. Alexander had crushed empires, founded cities, and declared himself a living god. Now India stood before him, a land that Greek geographers described as the eastern edge of the world, famous for its wealth, its strange creatures, and the wisdom of its naked philosophers who sat under trees and contemplated the meaning of existence. The battle that followed is considered one of Alexander's greatest feats of tactics. Under cover of a thunderstorm, he led part of his cavalry upstream, crossed the river at a spot hidden by an island, and struck the army of King Porus from the side, while his main force crossed the river from the front. The fighting was fierce and costly. The great war elephants caused terrible panic among the Macedonian horses, and the Indian forces fought with desperate courage. By the end of the day, Alexander had won, but at a price that shook even his battle-hardened soldiers. What happened next produced one of the most famous exchanges in military history. Porus, wounded and brought before Alexander, was asked how he wished to be treated. "As one king would treat another king," he replied. Impressed by this dignity, Alexander not only spared him, but gave him back his kingdom, and even expanded it. This gesture served Alexander's interests, since he needed a loyal ally to manage a region he could not stay to govern. But it also showed a genuine respect for the courage of the people he had encountered. Alexander pressed on eastward, crossing river after river through the Punjab. But at the banks of another river, known today as the Bees, his army finally broke. The soldiers had been fighting for nearly 8 years, marching thousands of kilometers from their homes. They were exhausted, homesick, and deeply frightened by what they heard lay ahead, a kingdom to the east that was said to have 200,000 foot soldiers, 20,000 cavalry, and 3,000 more war elephants. The endless monsoon rains poured down day after day, rotting leather, rusting weapons, and turning the earth to mud. Alexander's officers refused to go any further. For 3 days, the great conqueror sat alone in his tent, furious and heartbroken, hoping his men would change their minds. They did not. It was the only time in his entire career that Alexander was stopped, not by an enemy army, but by the limits of his own soldiers' endurance. He raised 12 huge stone altars on the riverbank, dedicated to the 12 gods of his homeland, as markers of the furthest point of his march, and turned south toward the sea, beginning the long, agonizing retreat that would eventually claim his life in Babylon a few years later. Alexander's time in India lasted less than 2 years, and his direct political impact was brief. The kingdoms he conquered in the Punjab shook off his influence almost immediately after he left. Within a generation, a young Indian man named Chandragupta would sweep away everything Alexander had arranged and build an empire that made the Macedonians' Indian adventure look like a footnote. But the cultural consequences of this meeting between Greece and India would last for centuries. Alexander's campaign opened a channel between the two worlds that would carry ideas, art, and goods back and forth long after the armies had gone home. Greek settlers remained in the border regions of what is now Afghanistan and Pakistan, building communities that kept the traditions of the Greek world alive far from the Mediterranean. And it was in these communities that one of the most remarkable cultural blending in history took place. In the region known as Gandhara, Greek artistic traditions met Buddhist religious ideas, and the result was something entirely new. For the first time in history, sculptors began to show the Buddha as a human figure, wearing robes that looked like Greek garments, his face shaped with the smooth features of a Greek god. Before this, the Buddha had been represented only by symbols, a footprint, a tree, or an empty seat. The artists of Gandhara gave Buddhism its most recognizable image, a face that would travel the ancient trade roads all the way to China, Korea, and Japan. And that remains instantly known around the world to this very day. The exchange of ideas ran deep. Greek thinkers who traveled with Alexander were deeply impressed by the Indian holy men they encountered, those naked philosophers who seemed to have achieved a profound peace through contemplation alone. One Greek thinker was so moved by what he saw in India that he returned home and founded a school of radical doubt that influenced Western thought for centuries. Perhaps the most famous of the Greek kings who remained in India was one named Menander, who ruled a kingdom in the Punjab and the northwest. According to a Buddhist text, Menander engaged in a long philosophical conversation with a Buddhist monk, asking searching questions about the nature of the self, the reality of rebirth, and the logic of the spiritual path. Whether or not this conversation truly happened, the text itself is a beautiful example of what can emerge when two great intellectual traditions meet with genuine curiosity rather than fear. The encounter between Greece and India at the edge of Alexander's ambition was brief but profound. It was a meeting of two of the ancient world's greatest cultures, and each was enriched by contact with the other. But the most immediate consequence of Alexander's departure was political. His retreat from the Punjab left behind a power vacuum, and a young man with enormous ambition and a brilliant advisor was preparing to fill it. The legends say that a scholar named Chanakya, a brilliant but easily offended teacher from the famous university at Taxila, once arrived at the court of the most powerful king in northern India. The king, whose name was Dhanananda, insulted him publicly, perhaps mocking his appearance, perhaps dismissing his advice. Chanakya, burning with anger, is said to have untied the knot in his hair and sworn a vow. He would not tie it again until the Nanda dynasty was destroyed. It was a promise that would change the history of an entire subcontinent. The instrument of Chanakya's revenge was a young man named Chandragupta Maurya, someone of uncertain origins whose early life is wrapped in legend and conflicting stories. Some accounts describe him as a member of a minor clan, noticed by Chanakya for his sharp mind and fierce ambition. Greek sources suggest he may have met Alexander himself during the Macedonians' Indian campaign, and that Alexander's military methods made a lasting impression. What is certain is that by around 322 before the Common Era, guided by Chanakya's strategic genius, this young man had raised an army, overthrown the powerful Nanda dynasty, seized control of the kingdom of Magadha, with its great capital at Pataliputra, and declared himself king. It was the beginning of the Maurya Empire, the first political power to bring most of the Indian subcontinent under a single authority. Chandragupta moved quickly. He expanded westward into the lands that Alexander had conquered and then abandoned, absorbing the Punjab and pushing into what is now Afghanistan. When one of Alexander's successors, a Greek general named Seleucus, tried to reclaim those territories, Chandragupta defeated him and negotiated a remarkable deal. Seleucus gave up large stretches of land, and in return received 500 war elephants that proved decisive in the wars that were tearing the Greek world apart. A marriage alliance sealed the agreement, creating a diplomatic bridge between the young Indian Empire and the wider world. Seleucus also sent an ambassador to live at the Maurya court. This Greek diplomat, named Megasthenes, spent several years in the Indian capital and wrote a detailed account of everything he saw. Though his original book is lost, large fragments were preserved by later writers, and they paint an extraordinary picture. Megasthenes described Pataliputra as a vast city protected by wooden walls with hundreds of towers and more than 60 gates, surrounded by a massive defensive ditch. The army, he reported, consisted of hundreds of thousands of infantry, tens of thousands of cavalry, and thousands of war elephants. Even if these numbers are exaggerated, they point to a military establishment of staggering size and a kingdom of enormous resources. The system that made such power possible was described in one of the most remarkable books of the ancient world, a comprehensive handbook of rule and governance attributed to Chanakya under his scholarly name. Whether the book was actually written by Chandragupta's advisor or assembled later from many sources is debated, but its contents are extraordinary regardless. It covers everything: the organization of government, the regulation of trade, the use of spies, the management of the treasury, the conduct of war, even the planting of trees and the maintenance of irrigation channels. The level of detail is sometimes startling. The book discusses poisoning, deception, and assassination as ordinary tools of statecraft, with the same calm tone it uses for tax policy and road maintenance. The empire was divided into provinces, each overseen by a royal prince or a trusted official. Government reached down to the village level, with officers responsible for collecting taxes, keeping order, and reporting back to the center. Spy networks were extensive. The book that describes all of this discusses how to plant informants, not only among enemies but among the empire's own officials, to make sure no one was plotting against the throne. Can you imagine what it must have been like, living in this world? A great capital city, teeming with people connected by roads to the farthest corners of a vast empire. Standardized weights and coins, making trade easier from the mountains of the northwest to the coasts of the east. Royal guards patrolling the highways. Tax collectors and spies everywhere. It was a new kind of state for India, a centralized power reaching into every corner of people's lives, a model that would influence Indian political thinking for centuries to come. The personal fate of Chandragupta himself is wrapped in one last haunting legend. According to one tradition, in his later years the great conqueror gave up his throne entirely. He became a wandering holy man, a follower of Jainism, and traveled to the far south of India, to a hill in what is now Karnataka. There it is said, he fasted until he died, following the Jain practice of voluntarily ending one's life through the peaceful renunciation of food. If this is true, it is one of the most extraordinary transformations in the story of human power, the man who conquered an empire dying as a naked monk on a southern hill, having given away everything he had spent his life winning. Whether or not Chandragupta truly ended his days in this way, his empire did not end with him. His son expanded the Maurya territories further south, and his grandson would take the empire to its greatest size and then do something the world had never seen before. He would use the power of an empire, not for conquest but for peace, not for war, but for the welfare of every living being under his rule. The seeds of that transformation, the vast territory, the administrative machinery, the philosophical traditions that made it thinkable, were all planted by Chandragupta and the brilliant, unforgiving scholar who had sworn to bring down a dynasty and built an empire in its place. In the year 261 before the Common Era, The army of the Maurya Empire swept into an independent kingdom on the eastern coast of India, in what is now the state of Odisha. The kingdom was called Kalinga, and its people had refused to submit to Maurya authority. Emperor Ashoka, the grandson of Chandragupta and the third ruler of the dynasty, was determined to bring them under his control. What followed was one of the bloodiest military campaigns of the ancient world, by Ashoka's own account, carved in stone for all the world to read. 100,000 people were killed in the fighting, 150,000 were driven from their homes, and many more died in the aftermath from hunger, disease, and despair. The Kalinga War was a complete military success. It brought the last major independent territory in the east under Maurya control, giving the empire authority over nearly all of modern India, from Afghanistan in the west to Bengal in the east, from the foothills of the Himalayas in the north to the high plateau of the south. The population may have reached 50 million. It was one of the largest empires on earth, but Ashoka did not celebrate. According to his own inscriptions, the emperor walked across the battlefield after the fighting was over, and the sight of what he had done overwhelmed him. The bodies heaped on the ground, the villages reduced to ash, the sound of people weeping for those they had lost. In his own words, carved into rock so that no one could ever change them, he wrote that the slaughter, death, and suffering of the people of Kalinga weighed heavily on his mind and filled him with deep remorse. What happened next is one of the most remarkable turns in the entire history of power. Ashoka embraced Buddhism and declared that from this point forward, he would conquer not by force of arms, but through goodness. He used a word that in his usage meant something larger than any single religion. It meant righteous living, compassion for all creatures, honest governance, and harmony among people of every faith and background. The way he communicated this new vision was itself something the world had never seen. He had his thoughts carved on rocks, on cave walls, and on great stone pillars erected at sites all across his empire, from the mountains of Afghanistan to the coasts of the south, from the western deserts to the eastern plains. About 35 separate inscriptions have been found, written in the everyday languages of the regions where they were placed. They are the earliest physical evidence we have for Buddhism in the archaeological record, and they make Ashoka one of the most thoroughly documented rulers of the ancient world. The edicts reveal a ruler of startling moral ambition. He banned the unnecessary killing of animals and created what may have been the world's first animal welfare laws. He planted trees along the roads and dug wells for travelers. He built places of healing, not only for people but for animals as well, and established gardens of medicinal plants. He created a new class of officials whose sole purpose was to promote goodness in every community, to ease suffering wherever it was found, and to pay special attention to the needs of women, prisoners, the elderly, and people living in remote places far from the centers of power. Ashoka was careful not to impose his own beliefs on anyone. His inscriptions emphasize respect among all faiths. He encouraged the followers of every tradition to honor one another, saying that the core of all teaching was the same: mercy, generosity, truthfulness, and purity. This policy of tolerance was remarkable in any age, but it was especially striking in the ancient world, where rulers typically promoted their own traditions and suppressed those of their rival. His desire to spread these ideals reached far beyond his own borders. He sent teachers and missionaries to the island we now call Sri Lanka, where his own son and daughter are remembered as the people who brought Buddhism to that land, a tradition that continues to flourish there today. Missions were also sent to other parts of Asia, and perhaps even to the Greek kingdoms around the Mediterranean, though how far those distant efforts reached remains unclear. The physical legacy of Ashoka's reign can still be seen and touched. The Lion Capital, a sculpture originally placed atop one of his great stone pillars at the site of the Buddha's first teaching, was adopted as the official symbol of the Republic of India when the country gained its independence in 1947. Its 4 lions, facing outward in 4 directions, sit above a base decorated with figures of animals and wheel. The wheel itself, the symbol of the righteous path that Ashoka championed, appears at the center of the Indian national flag to this very day. It is a direct link between an emperor who lived 23 centuries ago and the founding ideals of the world's largest democracy. Ashoka ruled for about 37 years, and after his death around 232, before the Common Era, the empire he had built declined quickly. His successors quarreled among themselves, and the central authority weakened. The last emperor of the Maurya line was killed by his own general around 185 before the Common Era, ending a dynasty that had dominated India for nearly 150 years. But Ashoka's significance reaches far beyond the life of his empire. The idea that a ruler should use power not for personal glory, but for the welfare of the people. The idea that tolerance and compassion should guide a government. These were not just ahead of their time. They are ideals that most modern nations still struggle to live up to, articulated on Indian stone pillars more than 2,000 years before anyone wrote a universal declaration of human rights. After Ashoka, India entered a time of fragmentation and change as new peoples from the northwest, Greeks, warriors from the Central Asian grasslands, and others poured through the mountain passes and established their own kingdoms on Indian soil. But the legacy of the Maurya Empire, its roads, its systems of governance, its promotion of Buddhism, and above all the moral example of its greatest ruler, would continue to shape Indian life for centuries to come. In the decades after the Maurya Empire crumbled, around 185 before the Common Era, the Indian subcontinent entered one of its most colorful and culturally rich periods. The northwestern frontier, always the doorway through which new peoples entered India, became something like a revolving door. Greeks, warriors from the Central Asian grasslands, Parthians, and eventually a people called the Kushans, each arrived in their turn, bringing with them new languages, new art, new beliefs, and new ways of seeing the world. The first to push deeper into India were the Greeks. The descendants of the soldiers Alexander had left behind in the border regions of what is now Afghanistan and Pakistan had been maintaining their own small kingdoms for over a century. Now, with the Maurya power gone, they expanded further into the subcontinent. The most remembered of these Greek kings was one named Menander, who ruled a territory stretching from Kabul to the rivers of the Punjab. Menander is famous not for his battles, but for a philosophical conversation preserved in a Buddhist text, in which the king asks a wise monk probing questions about the nature of the self, the reality of rebirth, and the logic of the spiritual path. Whether this conversation truly happened or was a later creation, it beautifully illustrates how two very different traditions of thought could meet and enrich each other. After the Greeks came people the Indians called the Shakas, nomads from the Central Asian grasslands who had been pushed out of their homeland by the movements of other migrating peoples. They established kingdoms in the northwest and in the western regions of Gujarat. Their era left behind some of the earliest precisely dated inscriptions in Indian history, and the calendar system they introduced is still used in India today. But the most significant of these newcomers were the Kushans, originally from the borders of China, who migrated south through Central Asia and eventually built an empire stretching from the trade routes of the interior all the way to the plains of the Ganges. At its height, under an emperor named Kanishka, the Kushan Empire controlled the crucial crossroads where the overland Silk Road met the routes leading into the heart of India. This position made the Kushans fabulously wealthy, and they used that wealth to support both Buddhism and the arts. Kanishka is remembered as a great patron of Buddhism. He called a major gathering of Buddhist scholars in the northern mountains to organize and preserve Buddhist teachings, and he is said to have been the first ruler to show the Buddha as a human figure on his coins. The art that flourished under the Kushans, in the region known as Gandhara, was unlike anything the world had seen, a fusion of Greek artistic skill and Buddhist spiritual content. Sculptors trained in the Greek tradition carved images of the Buddha wearing flowing robes, his face calm and serene, his features shaped with the smooth naturalism of a classical Greek statue. These sculptures gave Buddhism its most recognizable face, an image that would travel the ancient trade roads to the farthest corners of Asia. Meanwhile, far to the south, the Indian subcontinent was developing powerful states of its own. In the western Deccan, a dynasty known as the Satavahanas had risen to prominence. They controlled the valuable trade routes connecting the western coast, with its ports open to the merchants of the Roman world, to the interior of the peninsula. Under their care, magnificent Buddhist monuments were expanded and adorned with sculpture of breathtaking beauty, and the great rock-cut monasteries of the Western Ghats, including the early stages of the famous painted caves, began to take shape. And here the story takes a quiet but remarkable turn, because the trade flowing through all these kingdoms connected India to the wider world in ways that might surprise you. Indian merchants, riding the seasonal monsoon winds that they had learned to predict with great skill, carried cargoes of pepper, cinnamon, cardamom pearls, gems, ivory, and the finest cotton cloth in the world to the ports of the Roman Empire. A Greek sailing manual from the 1st century describes the Indian ports in careful detail, listing the goods they exported and the Roman gold they received in return. At a port on the southwest coast of India, in what is now Kerala. A thriving trading station served as the main meeting point between Indian and Roman commerce. A single cargo list from this era, preserved on a scrap of paper found in Egypt, records a shipment of pepper and other goods valued at a sum so enormous it would make a modern merchant blink. Hoards of Roman gold coins have been found scattered across southern India, silent evidence of a trade that was draining precious metal from the Roman treasury at a rate that made Roman officials deeply uneasy. The exchange went far beyond goods. Indian ideas about the stars, about numbers, and about the deepest questions of philosophy filtered westward through the Greek-speaking world, while Greek and Roman artistic techniques influenced Indian sculptors and builders. Indian animal fables traveled the trade routes to Persia and eventually to medieval Europe. The influence moved in both directions, a quiet conversation between civilizations that enriched them all. The period between the fall of the Mauryas and the rise of the next great dynasty, stretching from roughly 185 before the Common Era to 320 in the Common Era, is sometimes called a dark age in Indian history. But that label could not be more wrong. It was an era of extraordinary creativity, when the meeting of Indian, Greek, Central Asian and Roman traditions produced art, philosophy, literature and science of the very highest quality. The political variety of these centuries also taught an important lesson, by showing that Indian civilization could flourish under all sorts of political arrangements, from Greek-style kingdoms to Buddhist religious communities to tribal republics. This era established a pattern that would repeat throughout Indian history. Some of India's most brilliant achievements would come during periods of the greatest political division. Unity was not the only path to greatness, but the desire for unity had not disappeared. In the early 4th century of the Common Era, a new dynasty arose in the familiar setting of Magadha, the same land that had given birth to the Mauryas. Under their rule, India was about to enter what many historians consider the single greatest flowering of its classical civilization. In the courtyard of a mosque in Delhi, surrounded by the remains of much older buildings, stands an iron pillar that has puzzled scientists for generations. It is about 7 meters tall, weighs roughly 6 tons, and was made sometime in the 4th century of the Common Era. What makes it extraordinary is not its size or its age, but the fact that despite standing in the open air for more than 1600 years, exposed to monsoon rains and blazing heat, it has never rusted. Modern study has revealed the secret. The ancient smiths who forged this pillar used techniques that created a thin, invisible protective layer on the surface of the iron, a natural shield that keeps moisture and air from reaching the metal beneath. These craftsmen achieved through centuries of practical skill what modern science would not fully understand until much, much later. And this pillar is a fitting symbol of the era that produced it, a time when Indian civilization reached heights of brilliance that have led historians to call it the Golden Age. The Gupta Empire, founded around 320 in the Common Era and lasting in various forms until roughly 550, was not the largest empire India had ever seen. At its height, it controlled the northern half of the subcontinent, never reaching as far south as the Mauryas had. But in terms of art, literature, science, and philosophy, the Gupta period has few equals anywhere in the world. The dynasty began with a strategic marriage that gave its founder a base of power in the Gangetic heartland. But it was his son, a ruler of almost unstoppable energy, who turned this small kingdom into an empire. Through a long career of military campaigns, this warrior king defeated 9 northern kings and subdued 12 southern ones, building an empire that stretched across the breadth of northern India. His grandson then extended the realm westward, gaining access to the wealthy seaports and their trade with the wider world. The court of this empire attracted the finest minds of the age, and none was more brilliant than the poet and playwright considered the greatest writer in the Sanskrit language, a figure sometimes called the Shakespeare of India. His most famous play tells the story of a king's love for a beautiful woman of the forest, their separation through a magical curse, and their eventual reunion. It is a work of such lyric beauty that when it was translated into European languages centuries later, the great German writer Goethe declared he had never encountered a more beautiful flower of poetry. Another of this poet's works describes a lover sending a message to his distant beloved by way of a passing cloud, describing the towns and rivers and mountains of India as the cloud drifts across the sky. It remains one of the most beloved works in all of Indian literature. The scientific achievements of this era were equally remarkable. A mathematician and astronomer born in 476 of the Common Era, working at the great University of Nalanda, calculated the value of the mathematical constant we call pi to 4 decimal places. He proposed that the Earth spins on its own axis, an idea that would not be accepted in Europe for another 1,000 years. He correctly explained why eclipses happen, understanding them as shadows rather than the work of cosmic forces. And he developed a system of writing numbers using positions and powers of 10, with a symbol for the concept of nothing. Ideas so fundamental that the entire modern world depends on them every single day. In medicine, the traditions of this era described surgical procedures of remarkable skill, including the reconstruction of noses using skin from the forehead, the removal of clouded lenses from the eye, and the treatment of stones inside the body. These techniques were practiced in India centuries before anything similar appeared elsewhere. The visual arts of the Gupta period reached a perfection that set the standard for all Indian art that followed. The paintings in the famous rock-cut caves, created during this era and just after it, depict scenes from Buddhist stories with a mastery of line, color, and depth that places them among the greatest achievements of world art. The sculpture of the period, especially the serene images of the Buddha, combines spiritual depth with a grace of form that captures the broader spirit of the age, a time when intellectual precision and artistic beauty were understood as two expressions of the same truth. This was also a time of religious change. The Gupta emperors were devoted to the god Vishnu, but they supported all the religious traditions of India, including Buddhism, Jainism, and the growing devotional movements within Hinduism. The great epic poems, those sweeping narratives of heroes, gods, and great battles that had been told and retold for centuries, reached something close to their final written form during this period. And one of the most influential texts in all of Indian thought, a dialogue between a prince and a divine charioteer on the eve of a great battle, emerged as a cornerstone of Indian philosophy, offering a vision that wove together action, knowledge, and devotion in a way that spoke to people of every station in life. Can you imagine what it must have felt like to live in this world? A civilization where poets composed works of heartbreaking beauty in the same courts, where mathematicians were inventing the number system the entire planet would eventually use, where surgeons performed operations that would not be attempted elsewhere for 1,000 years, where painters created images in dark caves that still take the breath away today. The Gupta Empire began to weaken in the late 5th century, as invaders from Central Asia poured through the mountain passes of the northwest and established their own kingdoms. By the middle of the 6th century, the central authority had broken apart, and India once again became a patchwork of regional kingdoms. But the cultural legacy of the Golden Age proved far more lasting than any political structure. The artistic styles, the literary traditions, the scientific methods, and the philosophical ideas developed during this era continued to shape Indian life for centuries, and their influence spread along trade routes to the far corners of Asia, making the Gupta contribution not just Indian but truly global. In the year 628 of the Common Era, a mathematician sitting in the ancient city of Ujjain, in what is now central India, wrote a sentence that would quietly transform the entire future of human thought. He stated that when 0 is added to a number, the number remains unchanged, and when 0 is multiplied by any number, the result is 0. These rules seem so obvious to us now that it takes a real effort of imagination to understand that for most of human history, nobody had ever stated them. This mathematician did not merely use 0 as a blank space, a placeholder showing that a certain position in a number was empty. He treated 0 as a number in its own right, with its own properties and its own rules. And in doing so, he gave the world one of the most powerful tools of thought it has ever possessed. The story of Indian mathematics is the story of ideas so woven into modern life that we have forgotten they were ever invented. The number system used by nearly every civilization on Earth today, the 10 digits from 0 through 9, arranged in a system where the position of each digit tells you its value, was developed in India over several centuries, beginning perhaps as far back as the 3rd century before the Common Era. The symbols themselves evolved from an earlier Indian script that appears in the inscriptions of Emperor Ashoka, and they changed shape as they traveled from India to the Arab world and then to Europe, acquiring their modern forms along the way. This system of writing numbers is so natural to us that we rarely think about the alternatives. But consider the Romans, for all their engineering brilliance. In their system, the number 1888 required 13 separate characters strung together, and trying to multiply or divide with such a system was a nightmare. The Babylonians used a base 60 system, clever but lacking a clear symbol for nothing. Only in India did thinkers develop a system that combined a base of 10 with a positional structure and a symbol for 0, creating a tool of such elegant simplicity that it could express any number, no matter how vast, using just 10 symbols. An earlier mathematician working at the great University of Nalanda around 500 of the Common Era had already been using this decimal system for his calculation. He figured out the value of pi to 4 decimal places. He proposed that the Earth rotates on its own axis, something that would not be widely accepted in Europe until many centuries later. He correctly explained eclipses as the play of shadows rather than the work of supernatural forces. And he calculated the length of the year to within about 3 minutes of the modern value. His younger contemporary compiled knowledge of the stars from Indian, Greek, and Roman sources, showing just how internationally connected Indian science already was. The mathematician and Ujjain went further still. Beyond his groundbreaking rules for zero, he provided methods for working with negative numbers, which he called debts, as opposed to positive numbers, which he called fortunes. He found solutions to types of equations that European mathematicians would not tackle for another 1,000 years. His great treatise was eventually translated into Arabic at the famous center of learning in Baghdad, where it became one of the founding texts of the mathematical tradition of the Islamic world. And here is where the story becomes truly global. Around 825 of the Common Era, a Persian mathematician working in Baghdad wrote a book introducing the Indian number system and its methods of calculation to the wider Islamic world. When this book was later translated into Latin, the author's name was rendered as algorithmi, and from that garbled name comes the English word algorithm, the fundamental idea behind every computer and every piece of software on Earth. The numbers themselves, passing through Arab hands and taking on new visual forms, became known in Europe as Arabic numerals, a name that erased the Indian origins of one of humanity's most important gifts. It was not until the 13th century that these Indian numbers finally reached Europe, carried by an Italian mathematician who had learned them from Arab merchants in North Africa. His book introduced what he carefully called the method of the Indians to European readers. The adoption was slow. European bankers and merchants clung to their old Roman numerals for another century and more. Some cities actually banned the new numbers, suspicious of a system that included a symbol for nothing. But the superiority of the Indian method was undeniable, and by the 1400s, it had conquered Europe as completely as it had conquered Asia. Perhaps the most extraordinary chapter in this whole story was written in the far southwestern corner of India, in the lush, rain-soaked land of Kerala. Beginning in the 1300s, a school of mathematicians working in this remote region developed methods of calculating with infinite series, techniques for working with certain mathematical functions that are identical to discoveries that would be made independently in Europe, 200 to 300 years later, by some of the most famous names in Western science. The founder of this tradition, a mathematician who lived from roughly 1340 to 1425, calculated the value of pi to 11 decimal places using an infinite series. His successors refined and extended his work, producing results that represent the earliest known examples of certain advanced mathematical ideas outside of the simplest cases. These achievements raise one of the most tantalizing questions in the history of science. What might have happened if this work had been widely shared? Unlike the Indian number system, which traveled the world, the discoveries of this school seem to have stayed within a small community of scholars in southwestern India. Whether they somehow reached Europe through later channels, or whether European mathematicians arrived at the same ideas entirely on their own, remains an open question. The mathematical legacy of India is woven into the fabric of everyday life in ways most people never notice. Every time you use a phone, make a purchase, write a line of computer code, or simply count to 10, you are using tools that were shaped in the minds of Indian thinkers, working in the courts of ancient emperors, the halls of great universities, and the quiet scholarly communities of medieval Kerala. The concept of zero, the system of numbers we all use, the foundations of algebra, the first steps toward the mathematics of change and motion. These are India's gifts to the world, gifts so fundamental that they have become invisible like the air we breathe. On the shore of the Bay of Bengal, about 60 kilometers south of the modern city of Chennai, a temple stands at the water's edge, its stone walls darkened by centuries of salt spray and monsoon rain. It was built by a southern Indian king in the early 8th century, one of the earliest stone temples in this part of the country. But this temple is only the most visible remnant of a world that was already ancient when it was built. A world of poets, merchants, warriors, and sailors whose achievements rivaled anything produced in the great empires of the north. The history of South India has too often been treated as a footnote, to the history of the Gangetic kingdoms, a secondary story overshadowed by the Mauryas, the Guptas, and the Mughals. This is a serious mistake. For much of Indian history, the south was wealthier, more connected to the world, and more culturally productive than the north. Its dynasties built the largest temples on the subcontinent, commanded the most powerful navies in the Indian Ocean, and maintained trade networks stretching from Rome to China. The story of South India is not a sideshow. It is, in many ways, the main event. The earliest literary window into this world comes from a body of Tamil poetry composed between roughly the 3rd century before the Common Era and the 3rd century after it. These poems, gathered into great anthologies, describe a vibrant society organized around 3 landscapes: the coast, the farming lowlands, and the hills. They celebrate love, war, the beauty of the natural world, and the deeds of kings, all written in a Tamil language that is already polished and sophisticated, suggesting centuries of tradition behind it. The poets name 3 great kingdoms of the far south: the Cheras along the western coast, the Cholas of the great river delta, and the Pandyas of the extreme southern tip, dynasties whose names would echo through more than 1,000 years of history. In the 6th century, a dynasty called the Pallavas rose to prominence in the southeast, and they began the great age of temple building in South India. Their earliest monuments were carved directly from the rock itself, shaped out of natural stone outcrops along the coast. One of their masterworks is an enormous wall of carved stone depicting a scene so vast and so detailed that it is considered one of the largest open-air sculptures in the world. Standing before it, you can see figures of gods and humans and animals, all flowing downward in a cascade of stone that captures a moment of cosmic drama, with breathtaking skill. To the west, another dynasty was experimenting with temple forms at a cluster of sites that are sometimes called the cradle of Indian temple architecture. Over 125 stone temples were built there, many of them testing new shapes and structures, charting the evolution from caves to freestanding buildings. The architecture there blends the styles of the north and the south, reflecting its position at the crossroads of the subcontinent. But it was the Chola dynasty that would take South Indian civilization to its greatest heights. The Cholas, one of the oldest dynasties in Indian history, experienced a dramatic revival in the 9th century and reached their peak under 2 extraordinary rulers in the late 10th and early 11th centuries. Under their leadership, the Chola Empire became the dominant power in both peninsular India and across the Indian Ocean, projecting military strength in a way that no previous Indian state had ever achieved. The first of these rulers conquered the rival kingdoms of the south, took portions of the island of Sri Lanka, and occupied the distant islands of the Maldives. But his greatest legacy stands in stone. The great temple he built at his capital is one of the tallest temple towers in the world, rising to a height of 66 meters. The stone at the very top, a single block weighing roughly 80 tons, was raised to that height using a ramp that reportedly stretched 6 kilometers. The entire building was constructed of granite, and its walls are covered with inscriptions recording the grants, campaigns, and administration of the empire. It is a monument of staggering ambition. His son went even further. In 1025, he launched a naval expedition against a maritime empire in Southeast Asia, attacking ports across the Malay Peninsula and the islands of what is now Indonesia. This remarkable campaign, one of the very few examples of an Indian state projecting military power overseas, was driven by a desire to secure trade routes and break the foreign monopoly on the rich sea commerce between India and China. Tamil merchant guilds had been active along these routes for generations, and this military venture ensured their continued prosperity. The navy that made all of this possible was a true seagoing force, capable of sustained operations across the open ocean, an achievement of logistics and seamanship that speaks to a level of organization few Indian states had ever possessed. Can you picture those ships, built of teak and palm fiber, carrying soldiers and merchants across the vast expanse of the Bay of Bengal toward distant shores? The cultural influence of the Cholas reached far beyond the range of their armies. South Indian traditions of temple worship, devotional poetry, and the cults of the great gods spread through Southeast Asia along the same routes that carried Tamil merchants and their goods. The famous temple complex in Cambodia, the Hindu temples of Java, and the traditions of Bali all carry the deep imprint of South Indian religious and artistic influence. And the bronze sculptures of this era, particularly the image of the great god dancing within a ring of fire, 4 arms expressing the simultaneous creation and destruction of the universe, are among the supreme achievements of world art. Cast with a technique of exquisite precision, These figures possess a grace that rivals the finest sculpture of any civilization. That image of the dancing god has become one of the most recognized symbols of Indian culture anywhere in the world. By the 13th century, the Chola Empire had given way to other powers, and the political landscape of the south was once again divided. But the legacy of these magnificent southern dynasties endures, in the temples that still draw millions, in the dance and music traditions that trace their roots to the courts of those ancient kings, in the richness of the Tamil literary heritage, and in the maritime tradition that placed South India at the center of the world's economy for centuries upon centuries. In a warehouse in an ancient Egyptian port on the western shore of the Red Sea, archaeologists found something remarkable: a large pottery jar filled with black peppercorns, perfectly preserved by the desert air for nearly 2,000 years. That pepper had traveled from the hills of southwestern India, carried by merchants who had learned to ride the seasonal winds across the Arabian Sea, a journey of several weeks connecting two of the ancient world's great civilizations. That a spice grown on the green slopes of Kerala could end up in a Roman storage room in Egypt tells you something important about India's place in the ancient world. For most of recorded history, India was not on the edges of global trade. It was at the very center. The numbers tell a remarkable story. Around the beginning of the Common Era, the Indian subcontinent produced roughly a third of the entire world's economic output, making it the largest economy on Earth. 1,000 years later, India's share had dipped only slightly, and it remained among the wealthiest places on the planet. This dominance, sustained for well over 1,000 years, was built on three things: India's extraordinary agricultural richness, its unmatched skill in making things, especially cloth, and its position at the heart of the trade routes connecting East Asia, Southeast Asia, the Middle East, and the Mediterranean world. The spice trade was the most glamorous part of this commerce, but it was far from the only part. Indian cloth, woven from cotton that grew better in India than anywhere else, was desired by every civilization from Rome to China. The muslins of Bengal were so fine they were called woven wind, the printed cottons of Gujarat, the silk brocades of the holy city of Varanasi. These were luxury goods that commanded enormous prices in distant markets. Indian steel, produced through a special process in which iron and other materials were heated in sealed clay vessels at very high temperatures, was the raw material for the legendary swords that European crusaders later encountered in the Middle East. Those blades were famous for their strength, flexibility, and the beautiful wavy patterns that appeared on their surface. India's sea trade was driven by the monsoon, the great seasonal wind system that governs the Indian Ocean. From April to September, the winds blow from Africa toward India, carrying ships loaded with gold, wine, and other goods from the Roman world. From October to March, the winds reverse direction, carrying ships back toward Africa and Arabia, now loaded with Indian pepper, gems, cloth, and spices. This predictable pattern made the Indian Ocean the most navigable of the world's great bodies of water, and merchants from India, Arabia, and later China used it to build a trading system of extraordinary reach. The Roman appetite for Indian goods was enormous. A Roman writer of the 1st century complained that Rome was spending vast fortunes each year on imports from India, and the largest share of that spending went to pepper alone. A Greek sailing manual from the same period describes the Indian ports in careful detail, listing the goods they sold and the gold they received. At the main pepper port on the southwestern coast, Roman merchants maintained permanent trading stations. A single cargo list from this era, preserved on a scrap of paper found in Egypt, records a shipment valued at a sum so immense it takes your breath away. And across southern India, hordes of Roman gold coins have been dug out of the earth, silent testimony to a trade that was draining precious metal from Rome at a rate that deeply worried Roman officials. The trade routes extended far beyond Rome. Indian merchants sailed regularly to Southeast Asia, where Indian culture, religion, language, and art profoundly shaped the development of kingdoms across what is now Myanmar, Thailand, Cambodia, Vietnam, and Indonesia. The great temple complexes of those regions, the political ideas, the religious traditions all bear the deep imprint of Indian influence carried along these maritime highways over centuries of contact. Eastward, Indian goods reached China through both overland and sea routes. Westward, they traveled not only to Rome, but to the ports of the Persian Gulf, where Indian merchants had been trading partners since the days of the Indus Valley Civilization, thousands of years earlier. India sat at the center of a web of trade that covered most of the known world. And this was not merely a matter of geographic luck. Indian craftspeople produced goods of a quality that their competitors simply could not match. Indian cotton cloth dominated world markets for over 2,000 years, not because cotton grew only in India, but because Indian weavers, dyers, and printers possessed skills refined over countless generations. Their techniques for fixing colors into cloth, making dyes that would not fade even after repeated washing, were methods that European textile makers would not master until the 18th century. India's position at the center of world trade would last until the colonial era, when European powers, armed with guns and ships, would systematically take apart the Indian manufacturing base and redirect the subcontinent's wealth to their own treasuries. The transformation of India from the workshop of the world to a supplier of raw materials is one of the great economic tragedies of modern history. But for thousands of years before that happened, India was the place where the goods that the world wanted most were made, the crossroads through which the world's wealth flowed, and the civilization whose products were desired by every other civilization on Earth. And now let us return to the north, where the last great emperor of a united Hindu India was about to meet a traveler from China, who would leave behind the most detailed description of 7th century India that has survived to our day. In the year 630 of the Common Era, a Chinese Buddhist monk arrived at the court of an Indian emperor after a journey of almost unimaginable hardship. He had traveled overland from China, crossing deserts, climbing mountain passes, and enduring years of danger and exhaustion, all to study the philosophy of Buddhism at its source. The monk's name was Xuanzang, and he would remain in India for nearly 13 years, visiting monasteries, debating scholars, and writing the most detailed account of 7th century India that has come down to us. At the center of the world he described stands the remarkable figure of Emperor Harsha. Harsha became king at the age of 16 under the worst possible circumstances. His father had recently died, and his older brother was murdered while trying to rescue their sister, who had been imprisoned after the killing of her husband. The teenage boy was suddenly responsible for a kingdom under attack, a missing sister, and a brother's death to avenge. What he did with these terrible circumstances was remarkable. Over the next 6 years, he conquered nearly all of northern India, creating an empire that stretched from the western deserts to the eastern coast. The Chinese monk described Harsha as a ruler of exceptional energy and generosity. The emperor traveled constantly across his vast domains, personally inspecting the conditions of his people. He supported Buddhism, Hinduism, and Jainism with equal enthusiasm, funding monasteries and temples, sponsoring gatherings of scholars, and debating philosophical questions with learned monks. Every 5 years, he held a great assembly at a sacred meeting of rivers, where he gave away the entire accumulated wealth of the royal treasury to the poor, to priests, and to religious institutions. His generosity was reportedly so complete that he left these assemblies wearing borrowed clothes. The great university that the Chinese monk visited was one of the wonders of the ancient world, located in what is now the state of Bihar. It was a vast complex of huge temples and separate compounds, all enclosed within high walls. Thousands of monks lived and studied there, pursuing not only Buddhist teachings, but also the older sacred texts, logic, grammar, medicine, astronomy, and mathematics. Students came from across Asia, from China, Korea, Tibet, and Southeast Asia. The library was housed in a tower, said to be 9 stories tall, and its collection of manuscripts, accumulated over centuries, was reportedly so vast that when it was eventually destroyed, the books burned for 3 months. Harsha himself was a man of considerable learning. He wrote plays in Sanskrit, and his court poet composed a biography that stands as one of the earliest examples of that form in Indian literature. In 643, Harsha organized an 18-day gathering of scholars at his capital, bringing together thinkers from across his empire. The Chinese monk was the guest of honor and is said to have bested hundreds of debaters from various traditions, though this account may reflect the literary conventions of Buddhist writing more than strict historical accuracy. Harsha also reached out to the great power on the other side of Asia, the Tang dynasty of China. He sent ambassadors to the Chinese court, and the Chinese emperor sent envoys in return. This exchange between the 2 greatest empires in Asia at that time represented a high point of diplomatic contact across the ancient world. When Harsha died and a usurper seized his throne, a Chinese envoy actually returned with a borrowed army from Tibet and Nepal and removed the usurper, a remarkable episode that shows just how connected India was to the wider Asian world. But for all his brilliance, Harsha's empire did not survive him. When he died in 647 without a clear heir, the empire fell apart almost immediately, splitting into a patchwork of competing kingdoms. The speed of this collapse suggests that the empire had been held together not by lasting institutions, but by the force of a single extraordinary personality. The university survived Harsha by several centuries, continuing to draw scholars from across Asia and maintaining its reputation as the greatest center of Buddhist learning in the world. But in 1193, it was attacked and destroyed by an invading army. The monks were killed, and the great library was set on fire. The destruction of this center of learning was a catastrophic loss, not just for Buddhism in India, but for the entire intellectual heritage of South Asia. Manuscripts that had been accumulating for 700 years were gone in a matter of weeks, and their loss remains one of the great cultural tragedies in human history. The passing of Harsha and the eventual destruction of the great university marked the end of an era. The Buddhist institutions that had flourished in the Gangetic Plain for over 1,000 years were in decline, weakened by the loss of royal support and the rising energy of a revived Hindu tradition. The great centers of learning that had once drawn students from across the continent gradually emptied, and Buddhism, the faith that had been born in the heartland of India, would eventually almost disappear from the land of its birth, surviving mainly in the mountain regions of Nepal and Tibet, and in the distant countries where Indian missionaries had carried it centuries earlier. The India that the Chinese monk had described with such love and care, a land of great monasteries and generous kings, of scholarly debates and thriving trade, was about to enter a new and very different chapter. A powerful new force was gathering beyond the mountain passes of the northwest, and its arrival would reshape the religious, cultural, and political life of the subcontinent in ways that could scarcely have been imagined. High above the Thar Desert, on a ridge of honey-colored sandstone that rises like a mirage from the arid landscape of western Rajasthan, stands the fortress of Jaisalmer. Built in the 12th century, it is one of the very few living forts in the world, a citadel where about 3,000 people still make their homes within its massive walls, carrying on a tradition of habitation stretching back nearly 900 years. Jaisalmer is just one of dozens of spectacular fortresses that crown the hills and ridges of northern India, monuments to a warrior culture that dominated the landscape of the subcontinent for centuries. The Rajputs, whose name comes from a Sanskrit phrase meaning sons of kings, were not a single group, but a collection of warrior clans who rose to power across northern India after the fragmentation of Harsha's empire. Their origins are debated. Some clans claim descent from the Sun and Moon dynasties of ancient mythology. Others were clearly newcomers, people of Central Asian or tribal origin who had been absorbed into the warrior class through a process of social movement that contradicted the rigid theory of the caste system, even as they fiercely defended that system in practice. Whatever their origins, the Rajputs created a distinctive culture built around honor, valor, and loyalty carried to extraordinary extremes. Their code demanded that a warrior fight to the death rather than surrender, that a king protect his people at any cost, and that the women and children of a besieged fortress choose death by fire rather than face capture. This last practice, in which women lit a great funeral pyre and walked into the flames, while the men rode out for a final suicidal charge, is among the most harrowing aspects of Rajput history. The fortresses of Chittorgarh and Jaisalmer witnessed this terrible ritual more than once, and these events remain deeply embedded in the memory of the region. The fortresses themselves were among the most impressive military structures in the world. Chittorgarh, perched on a plateau 300 meters above the plain, encloses an area vast enough to contain palaces, temples, towers, and water reservoirs, capable of supporting tens of thousands of people during a siege. Another fortress is said to have walls stretching 36 kilometers around its perimeter, making it one of the longest continuous walls anywhere on Earth. Yet another, rising sheer from the plains, was so formidable that a famous writer called it the work of angels, fairies, and giants. One Rajput dynasty played a particularly important role in Indian history by forming a wall of resistance against the expansion of Arab armies from the west. After the Arabs conquered the region of Sindh in 711, this dynasty, together with powers in the south and the east, held firm for over 2 centuries, preventing the new arrivals from pushing deeper into the heartland. Their resistance earned them a lasting reputation as defenders of India, though the reality of medieval politics was always more tangled than any simple story of resistance. The most celebrated figure of Rajput history is the last independent Hindu king of Delhi, a ruler whose life became the subject of one of the most famous works in all of Hindi literature. In 1191, he defeated an invading army from the northwest, inflicting a serious wound on the enemy commander. But the following year, the invader returned with a larger force of swift mounted archers. At the decisive battle in 1192, these mobile horsemen outmaneuvered the heavier Rajput cavalry and war elephants. The Rajput forces were shattered, the king was captured and killed, and the door to northern India swung open. This battle is often seen as a turning point, the beginning of centuries of Muslim political control over the north. The reasons for the Rajput defeat ran deeper than any single engagement. The tactics of mobile mounted archery gave the invaders a flexibility that the Rajputs, with their traditions of heavy cavalry charges and rigid codes of single combat, could not answer. And the fractious nature of the Rajput clans, always more willing to fight each other than to form a united front against a common enemy, meant that the Indian side lacked the coordination needed to meet a disciplined, unified force. But the Rajputs were far more than victims of history. Many Rajput kingdoms survived in the deserts and hills of Rajasthan for centuries, maintaining their independence through a mixture of resistance and strategic alliance. Some rulers allied with the Delhi Sultanate and later with the Mughal Empire, offering military service in exchange for the freedom to govern their own lands. Others fought to the bitter end, their stories remembered in ballads and songs still sung in Rajasthan today. The Rajput courts were also significant centers of culture. They supported a rich tradition of miniature painting, with several schools producing works of exquisite beauty, depicting religious themes, romantic legends, and scenes of daily life. The bardic tradition of professional poets and storytellers kept the history of the clans alive across generations, weaving together fact and legend in ways that still make it difficult to separate the two. The legacy of the Rajput age is complex. The martial courage and architectural splendor of these kingdoms remain a source of deep pride. But the customs associated with their honor culture, including the terrible practice of women dying on funeral pyres, are now recognized for what they were. The hill forts of Rajasthan, several of which have been recognized by the world as heritage treasures, stand as monuments to a civilization that prized beauty and bravery in equal measure, even as the endless wars they were built to endure remind us of the heavy costs of medieval conflict. And now, we move to the force that would arrive through the mountain passes and transform northern India in ways the Rajputs could never have imagined. In 1193, barely a year after the decisive battle that had opened northern India to conquest, a general leading a small cavalry force rode east into the region of Bihar and attacked what his soldiers mistook for a military stronghold. It was not a fort. It was the great University of Nalanda, where thousands of monks lived in sprawling monasteries surrounded by a library that had been growing for 700 years. The monks offered no resistance. The soldiers killed them, set fire to the buildings, and moved on. The library, housed in a 9-story tower, burned for 3 months. In a single act of casual violence, one of the greatest collections of knowledge in the ancient world was wiped from existence. The age of the Delhi Sultanate had begun. The Sultanate was born from the aftermath of the invasion from the northwest. When the commander who had led those conquests was killed in 1206, his most trusted general, a man who had been born into a family in Central Asia, sold into slavery as a child, and educated by his master in the arts of war and governance, seized control of the conquered territories and declared himself ruler at Delhi. The dynasty he founded is known as the Slave Dynasty, a name that reflects one of the strangest facts of medieval history, that some of the most powerful rulers of the age had begun their lives in chains. This first ruler's most lasting creation is a tower of red sandstone and marble in Delhi that rises over 70 meters into the sky, the tallest structure of its kind in the world. It was completed by his successor, who also established Delhi as the permanent capital, organized the government along Central Asian and Persian lines, and won recognition from the spiritual leader of the wider Islamic world, lending the new state a legitimacy it had lacked. When this ruler died, his daughter briefly took the throne, becoming one of the very few women in the medieval Islamic world to rule in her own name. She was, by all accounts, a capable leader who rode at the head of her army. But the Turkish nobility refused to accept a woman as their sovereign, and she was overthrown and killed after a reign of less than 4 years. The most powerful ruler of the Sultanate was a man who seized the throne by murdering his own uncle. He was a military genius who became the first Muslim ruler to extend his authority across nearly the entire subcontinent, sending armies south to the wealthy kingdoms of the Deccan and even reaching the southernmost tip of India. But his most celebrated achievement was something defensive rather than offensive: the protection of India from the Mongol invasions that were devastating the rest of Asia. Between 1297 and 1306, The Mongols launched at least 6 major attacks on India, some reaching within striking distance of Delhi itself. Through careful preparation, fierce resistance, and the systematic strengthening of the frontier, this ruler turned back every single invasion. The significance of this accomplishment is hard to overstate. While the Mongol invasions destroyed the great center of learning in Baghdad, laid waste to Central Asia, and devastated Eastern Europe, India under the Sultanate remained intact. The most eccentric ruler of the era was a man who combined extraordinary learning with spectacular bad judgment. He was fluent in multiple languages, deeply knowledgeable in philosophy and mathematics, and generous to scholars and poets. He was also capable of decisions that defied all reason. In 1327, he ordered the entire population of Delhi to relocate to a city 1,500 kilometers to the south, a forced march that caused enormous suffering and was eventually reversed when the new capital proved unworkable. He introduced coins made of base metal that were supposed to circulate at the value of silver, an experiment in what we might today call paper money that collapsed when counterfeiters flooded the market and the treasury had to buy back worthless coins at face value. A great Moroccan traveler who visited this ruler's court and served as a judge in Delhi for several years left behind a vivid portrait. He described a man who swung wildly between extravagant generosity and terrible cruelty, who gave fortunes to poets one day and had officials punished in horrifying ways the next. Despite its obvious bias, this traveler's account remains one of the most important descriptions of life in 14th century India, a window into a court that drew scholars, merchants, and adventurers from across the Islamic world. The Sultanate began to fragment in the 14th century. Rival powers broke away in the south. Bengal became independent, and a series of weaker rulers allowed local governors to carve out their own territories. The final dynasty controlled little more than Delhi itself, and the last of its rulers met his end on the plains of Panipat in 1526, defeated by a new invader who brought with him something Indian armies had never faced before: gunpowder weapons. The legacy of the Delhi Sultanate remains a subject of deep debate. It brought destruction to temples and religious institutions, imposed discriminatory taxes, and conducted campaigns of considerable violence. But it also brought India into closer contact with the wider Islamic world, fostered a blending of Hindu and Muslim cultures that produced new forms of art, architecture, and literature, and created systems of government that later rulers would refine into one of the most sophisticated administrations in the pre-modern world. The Urdu language, which would become one of the great literary tongues of South Asia, had its roots in the mixing of Turkish, Persian, and local languages in the military camps of this era. The Sultanate was both a destroyer and a creator, and the India that emerged from its 3 centuries of rule was a fundamentally different world from the one that had existed before. In 1443, a Persian ambassador arrived at a city in southern India and found himself struggling to describe what he saw. The city stretched along a riverbank, its temples and palaces rising from a landscape of enormous granite boulders that looked as though giants had scattered them across the earth. He wrote that his eyes had never seen a place like it, and that his ears had never been informed that anything equal to it existed in the world. Some 80 years later, a Portuguese traveler visited the same city and declared it as large as Rome, with precious stones sold in open markets like vegetables, streets lined with columns, and a king whose costume was encrusted with gems like stars embedded in the sky. This was the City of Victory, the capital of the last great Hindu empire of India, and its story is one of the most dramatic in all of South Asian history. The empire was founded in 1336 by 2 brothers who had served earlier southern dynasties. The traditional account says they were inspired by a wise scholar who saw the creation of a Hindu kingdom as a defense against the advancing tide of Islamic conquest from the north. Whether this legend is historically accurate matters less than the strategic impulse behind it. This empire was, from its very beginning, conceived as a bastion of Hindu culture and independence in a changing world. For over 2 centuries, the empire flourished. Its wealth came from many sources: the extraordinary fertility of its river valley, the lucrative trade in spices, diamonds, and cloth that flowed through its ports on both coasts, and the taxes collected from a vast farming population. The Portuguese, who had established themselves on the western coast of India, became important trading partners, supplying the empire with horses from Arabia, a vital military resource in a region where the climate made horse breeding difficult. The greatest ruler of this empire is remembered as one of the most accomplished kings in all of Indian history, a warrior who subdued virtually all the southern kingdoms and pushed back the rival Muslim sultanates. He was also a patron of the arts and a writer himself, composing works in more than one language. His court attracted poets, scholars, and artists from across India. Under his reign, the capital reached its peak, with a population estimated at 500,000, making it by some accounts the second largest city in the world. The ruins of this great capital, preserved today at a site in northern Karnataka, reflect the empire's blending of traditions. There are towering temples and delicate pavilions, a building called the Lotus Palace that mixes Hindu and Islamic architectural elements, and massive elephant stables built with arched doorways. The most remarkable feature may be the musical pillars of one temple, thin columns of stone that produce distinct musical notes when struck, a feat of acoustic engineering that modern researchers are still working to fully understand. Can you picture that? Stone singing like an instrument, shaped by hands that understood the vibrations of the earth itself. To the north, a rival sultanate had been established in the Deccan in 1347, creating an independent Muslim kingdom with its own distinctive culture. This state maintained connections with Persia, Arabia, and the wider Islamic world, imported scholars and architects, and developed its own style of building that blended Indian and Middle Eastern traditions. Eventually, this sultanate fragmented into 5 smaller successor states, each with its own court and its own ambitions, competing with one another and with the great Hindu Empire to their south. The relationship between these powers was defined by near-constant warfare, fought over the fertile land between 2 great rivers. But the cultural exchange was far deeper than the conflict might suggest. The Hindu Empire adopted Islamic architectural elements, employed Muslim cavalry commanders, and traded extensively with Muslim merchants. The court dress of its kings borrowed from Persian and Turkish fashion, and its government language mixed freely with Arabic and Persian terms. War and culture moved in different directions, one dividing, the other blending. The catastrophe came in January of 1565. The combined armies of 4 of the 5 Deccan sultanates marched against the empire. The battle initially seemed to favor the defenders, but 2 Muslim generals serving in the Hindu army switched sides during the fighting, a betrayal that threw the imperial forces into chaos. The elderly regent of the empire, reportedly over 90 years old, was captured and killed on the battlefield. His death caused panic and turned the battle into a rout. What followed was one of the most thorough destructions of a great city in recorded history. The victorious armies sacked the capital for months, systematically breaking apart temples, palaces, and public buildings. The destruction was so complete that a city which had been one of the largest and wealthiest in the world was made uninhabitable. The empire continued in diminished form, retreating to other strongholds, but it never recovered its former glory. By 1646, the last traces of its authority had dissolved. Today, the ruins spread across 26 square kilometers of boulder-strewn landscape, a haunting monument to a civilization that once rivaled the greatest on Earth. Broken columns and toppled walls, overgrown with tropical vegetation and framed by those bizarre granite formations, create a landscape of surpassing beauty and sadness. It was recognized by the world as a heritage site, honoring not only what was built there, but also the poignant story of its destruction, a reminder that even the mightiest civilizations are vulnerable to the sudden reversals that have shaped this subcontinent from its earliest days. In a town in the fertile plains of the Punjab, sometime around the year 1499, a young man who worked as a revenue official went to bathe in the river one morning and did not come back. His clothes were found on the bank, and his friends and family assumed he had drowned. For 3 days, the town mourned. Then the young man reappeared, but he was changed. He would only say that there was no Hindu and no Muslim, a statement so radical in the context of late medieval Punjab that it was nothing less than a declaration of spiritual revolution. This young man was Guru Nanak, and his experience at that river would lead him to found one of the world's youngest major religions, a faith that today has over 25 million followers and has profoundly shaped the history of the Indian subcontinent. Guru Nanak was born in 1469 in a village in what is now Pakistan, into a Hindu family in a region that had been under Muslim rule for centuries. From an early age, he questioned the rituals and social divisions that defined religious life around him. He rejected the caste system, the worship of images, the practice of ritual fasting, and the idea that women were in any way lesser than men. These were positions that put him at odds with both the Hindu and the Muslim traditions of his time. After his transforming experience at the river, Nanak set out on a series of long journeys that took him, according to tradition, across India and possibly even to distant lands in the Middle East and Central Asia. Whether all these journeys actually took place is debated, but their meaning is clear. Nanak was engaging with the full range of human religious experience, showing that the truth he had encountered was not limited to any single tradition. His teachings were expressed through devotional songs composed in the language of ordinary people, not in the formal Sanskrit of the priests or the courtly Persian of the rulers, a deliberate choice that made his message accessible to farmers, craftsmen, and laborers. The heart of his teaching was elegant in its simplicity. There is one God, without form and eternal, who is available to every human being through meditation, honest work, and sharing with those in need. He established the practice of the communal kitchen, a place where all people, regardless of their caste, wealth, or faith, sat together on the floor and shared the same simple meal. In a society where caste determined even who you could eat with, this was a revolutionary act, a quiet but powerful challenge to one of the deepest divisions in Indian life. Before his death, Nanak appointed a successor, establishing a line of spiritual leadership that would pass through 10 human teachers over the next 2 centuries. Each built upon the work of those who came before, while responding to the changing times. The 5th teacher compiled a sacred scripture that brought together the writings of the Sikh teachers alongside the devotional poetry of Hindu and Muslim saints, creating one of the most remarkable interfaith collections in the history of religion. He also built the great temple at Amritsar, which remains the holiest site in Sikhism to this day. It was this 5th teacher's martyrdom that began to transform Sikhism from a peaceful devotional movement into a community prepared to fight for its survival. The Mughal emperor, suspicious of the growing influence of the Sikh teachers, had him arrested, tortured, and killed. His successor began the process of arming the community, wearing 2 swords to symbolize both spiritual and worldly authority. The 9th teacher faced an even more terrible test. When a group of scholars from Kashmir came to him for protection against a campaign of forced religious conversion, he agreed to stand up for them, knowing it would likely cost him his life. He traveled to the Mughal capital, refused the demand to convert, and was publicly executed in the main marketplace. His 9-year-old son watched from a distance. This act is remembered as a sacrifice made not for his own faith, but for the right of others to practice theirs. That 9-year-old boy grew up to become the 10th and final human teacher, the most consequential figure in Sikh history after Nanak himself. In 1699, at a great gathering, he called for volunteers willing to give their lives for the faith. 5 men from different backgrounds stepped forward, and these became the first members of a new community of warrior saints, bound by a strict code of discipline and outward identity. The initiation ceremony involved shared food, stirred with a double-edged sword, and those who joined accepted 5 articles of faith, including uncut hair, a wooden comb, a steel bracelet, a specific undergarment, and a sword. Every man took the name Singh, meaning lion, and every woman took the name Kaur, meaning princess, erasing caste distinctions in a single transformative act. Before his death, this final teacher made a decision of lasting consequence. He declared that there would be no more human teachers. Instead, the sacred scripture itself would serve as the eternal, living guide of the faith. This act of spiritual democracy ensured that Sikhism would never depend on any single human leader. The martial tradition that had been forged through centuries of persecution found its greatest political expression in a man born around 1780 who survived smallpox as a child and lost his father at the age of 12. By 19, he had captured the great city of Lahore, and by 21, he was proclaimed ruler of the Punjab, establishing the last major independent power on the subcontinent to resist British expansion. His empire stretched from the mountain passes of the northwest to the rivers of the east, and his army, modernized with the help of European officers, was the most formidable force in India outside British control. Remarkably, his court and army were deliberately multi-religious, with ministers and generals drawn from every faith. He died in 1839, and within a decade his empire had fallen to the British. But the tradition of courage, faith, and equality that he embodied lives on, shaping the culture of the Punjab and the identity of millions. On the morning of April 21st, 1526, 2 armies faced each other across the dusty plains of Panipat, about 90 kilometers north of Delhi. On one side stood the last sultan of the reigning dynasty, commanding perhaps 50,000 soldiers and 1,000 war elephants. On the other stood a Central Asian adventurer named Babur with a far smaller force of about 12,000 men. But Babur had 2 things his opponent lacked: a tactical brilliance honed by decades of fighting in the harsh mountains of his homeland, and a battery of cannons and matchlock guns that no Indian army had ever faced. By the end of the day, the Sultan lay dead on the field, and Babur had founded the dynasty that would rule India for over 3 centuries and create some of the most magnificent art, architecture, and literature in all of human history. Babur was one of history's most unlikely conquerors. Born in 1483 in a valley of what is now Uzbekistan, he was descended from 2 of the most fearsome conquerors the world has ever known. At the age of 11, he inherited a tiny kingdom and promptly lost it. He spent the next 20 years fighting for survival, capturing and losing the legendary city of Samarkand 3 times before finally giving up on his homeland and turning his ambitions toward India. What makes Babur truly remarkable is not his military career, but his autobiography, written with a clarity and honesty that would not become common in European memoir for another 2 centuries. His book describes battles and politics with the same loving attention he gives to the flowers in a garden, the taste of a melon, or the quality of the wine at a dinner. He records his own failures alongside his triumphs, his moments of despair alongside his victories. His first impressions of India are characteristically honest. He complained about the heat, the dust, the lack of good grapes, and the people he found unattractive, even as he marveled at the enormous wealth and teeming population of his new domain. His tactics at Panipat were decisive. He placed his cannons and guns behind a line of wagons tied together with ropes, creating a makeshift wall. When the opposing cavalry charged, they were funneled into killing zones where his mounted archers wheeled around the flanks while the guns held the front. The sound of the cannons terrified the war elephants, which turned and stampeded through their own ranks. The battle was over in a few hours. Babur died just 4 years later, and his son inherited an empire that was still fragile and contested. This son was a cultured man, a lover of poetry and the stars, but he lacked his father's instinct for war. Within a decade, he had lost everything to a brilliant Afghan warrior who defeated him and drove him into 15 years of exile. This brief interruption in Mughal rule was not without its own significance. The Afghan ruler built one of the great highways of Asia, stretching from the eastern coast of Bengal to the mountains of Afghanistan. He introduced a standardized silver coin that would evolve into the rupee, the currency India uses to this very day. He reformed the tax system, set up a postal network, and created an administrative structure that the Mughals themselves would later adopt. The exiled emperor eventually recovered his throne with the help of the Persian king, but his second reign lasted less than a year. In a scene that captures the gentle tragedy of his entire life, he tripped on the steep stairs of his library while hurrying to answer the call to prayer, fell, struck his head, and died within days. The man who transformed the Mughal Empire from an uncertain conquest into one of the greatest states the world has ever known was this emperor's 13-year-old son, who came to the throne upon his father's sudden death. Under the guidance of a capable general, the boy won a crucial battle that secured northern India. What he did with the next half-century of power was extraordinary. This young emperor was almost certainly unable to read or write, despite being surrounded by books and scholars all his life. But his mind was endlessly curious. He had texts read aloud to him constantly, maintained a library of over 24,000 books, and could recall passages years after hearing them. In his new capital, he built a special hall where he hosted debates among scholars of every faith, Muslim, Hindu, Jain, Zoroastrian, and even Christian missionaries from the Portuguese colony on the coast. He listened, questioned, and drew his own conclusions. The political expression of this openness was a policy of universal peace, a principle that treated all faiths and communities as equals before the state. He ended the tax on non-Muslims, stopped charging pilgrimage fees, and welcomed Hindu warriors into the highest ranks of his military and government. His most trusted finance minister was a Hindu who designed a land revenue system so sophisticated that its principles influenced Indian taxation well into the British period. His system of ranks organized the entire military and civil administration into a single hierarchy that drew its officers from every background, creating a governing class united by loyalty to the emperor rather than by religion or ethnicity. At its best, the Mughal state under this ruler was one of the most tolerant and efficiently governed empires in the world, overseeing more than 100 million people with a level of administrative skill that no European state of the era could match. He died in 1605, leaving behind an empire stretching from Afghanistan to Bengal, from Kashmir to the Great Plateau of the South, an empire of such wealth, cultural richness, and administrative brilliance that it would take his successors more than a century to undo what he had built. In the summer of 1631, in a military camp in southern India, where the Mughal army was waging yet another campaign, a woman died giving birth to her 14th child. She was the beloved wife of the emperor, and her death plunged the most powerful man in Asia into a grief so overwhelming that it reportedly turned his hair white within weeks. For an entire week, the emperor refused to conduct any business of state. For 2 years, he gave up music, fine clothing, and celebrations. According to those at court, he wept so constantly that his eyesight suffered. Out of this deep well of sorrow would rise the most famous building in the world, a monument that would become the very symbol of India itself. Construction began in 1632 on the banks of a great river in the city of Agra. The project would employ roughly 20,000 workers, stonemasons, marble carvers, calligraphers, and artisans drawn from across the empire and beyond. The materials came from across Asia with a reach that reflected the global connections of Mughal commerce. White marble from the quarries of Rajasthan, jade and crystal from China, turquoise from Tibet, sapphires from the island of Sri Lanka, carnelian from Arabia, diamonds from the mines of the Deccan. In all, 28 types of precious and semi-precious stones were set into the white marble in intricate floral patterns, a technique of stone inlay that the Mughals had learned from Italian craftsmen and then perfected far beyond its European origins. The building that emerged is a work of almost mathematical perfection. The central dome rises 68 meters above the ground, flanked by 4 towers that lean very slightly outward, a deliberate choice to ensure that in the event of an earthquake, they would fall away from the main structure rather than onto it. The entire complex, spread across more than 40 acres, is arranged along a central line of perfect mirror symmetry with gardens, reflecting pools, and smaller buildings framing the Great White Tomb in a composition of extraordinary harmony. The main structure was completed around 1648, with the surrounding complex finished a few years later, a building project that spanned more than 20 years. The cost was immense by any measure, but no number can capture the true expense, which was measured not only in gold but in the labor of thousands of skilled hands over 2 decades, the transport of materials across thousands of kilometers, and the organizational effort needed to coordinate what was among the most ambitious building projects of its century. The building is not merely beautiful, it is a spiritual statement carved in stone and light. The words inscribed on its walls are passages from the Holy Book of Islam, chosen and arranged to create a journey that culminates at the entrance to the burial chamber itself. The gardens, originally filled with fragrant flowers and fruit trees, represent the Islamic vision of paradise. The reflecting pool that stretches before the main structure creates a mirror image, doubling the building and hinting at the connection between the earthly world and something beyond it. And at different times of day and in different seasons, the white marble changes color. It glows pink in the morning, bright white at noon, golden in the evening, and a soft, translucent blue in moonlight, as though the building itself breathes with the passage of time. The emperor who built this monument was a builder on a scale that transformed the landscape of northern India. He constructed a massive red fortress in Delhi when he moved his capital there, a citadel containing halls of audience, where he governed from a throne so encrusted with gems that it was worth several times the cost of the great tomb itself. He built what remains the largest mosque in India, its courtyard able to hold 25,000 people. Every project he touched was marked by the same obsessive pursuit of perfection and beauty. The Mughal Empire at this time was, by most measures, the wealthiest state on earth. A French jeweler who visited the court described a level of splendor that made the greatest palaces of Europe seem modest. The empire's economy supported perhaps 150 million people, and some modern estimates suggest it accounted for roughly a quarter of the entire world's economic output, a share comparable to that of the whole European continent combined. The cities of the empire, Agra, Delhi, Lahore, and others, were among the largest in the world, and European visitors repeatedly expressed astonishment at the scale and elegance of Mughal life. But beneath all this magnificence, the seeds of trouble were already growing. The lavish building projects and the constant military campaigns in the south were straining even the vast Mughal treasury. And within the imperial family, a struggle for power was brewing that would tear the empire apart. The emperor fell seriously ill in 1657, and his 4 sons immediately went to war with one another over the throne. The winner was the 3rd son, a brilliant general and devoutly religious man who defeated his brothers one by one, executing 2 of them and imprisoning his own father in the Agra fortress. The old emperor spent his last 8 years as a prisoner in his own palace, gazing out from a tower at the white marble monument shimmering across the river, the building he had raised to the memory of the wife he had loved and lost. When he died, he was laid beside her in the quiet darkness beneath the great dome, reunited at last with the woman whose passing had inspired the most celebrated expression of love in the history of architecture. On a spring day in 1658, in a military camp somewhere in the dusty plains of central India, a man knelt in prayer on a simple cotton mat. He wore plain white cloth, had rough hands from years of copying his holy book by hand, and ate simple food that he paid for from his own modest earnings as a calligrapher and capmaker. This was no wandering holy man. This was the 6th Mughal emperor, ruler of the largest and most populous empire on earth, a man who commanded armies numbering in the hundreds of thousands, and who sat upon the most valuable throne ever made. Of all the contradictions in Indian history, few are as striking as the sight of the most powerful man in Asia living with the personal simplicity of a monk while waging wars of relentless expansion that would exhaust the very empire he had seized. He came to power through a war among brothers of extraordinary cruelty. When his father fell ill, the 4 sons immediately began fighting for the throne. This 3rd son proved the most ruthless and capable of all. He defeated his eldest brother, who had been their father's chosen heir, captured him, had him paraded through the streets in chains, and ordered his execution. He killed another brother after first allying with him and then betraying him. The 4th brother fled and was never heard from again. And then he imprisoned his own father, the great builder who had raised the most famous monument in the world, locking him away in the fortress of Agra for the rest of his days. The 50 years that followed represent the Mughal Empire at its greatest physical size, and, at the same time, the beginning of its fall. At its peak, the empire stretched across nearly the entire subcontinent, from the mountains of Afghanistan to the coast of Bengal, from Kashmir in the north to the rivers of the far south. No Indian ruler before or since has controlled so much territory. The population approached 150 million, and the annual revenue exceeded that of any European state of the time. But this emperor's religious policies reversed the careful balance that his great-grandfather had so brilliantly established. He reimposed the tax on non-Muslims that had been abolished more than a century before. He ordered the destruction of newly built Hindu temples, placed restrictions on Hindu festivals, and removed Hindu officials from high positions. The historical debate over the exact scope of these policies is ongoing, but their effect was unmistakable. They alienated the Hindu majority and provoked rebellions across the empire. The Rajput warriors, who had been loyal allies of the Mughal state for generations, revolted. Farmers in the Agra region rose up. The Sikhs, already radicalized by the execution of one of their teachers, became fierce and permanent enemies. And in the western Ghats of Maharashtra, a warrior named Shivaji had already built an independent kingdom that would prove to be the Mughal Empire's most persistent and ultimately fatal challenge. The military campaigns in the south consumed the last 25 years of this emperor's life and drained the empire of its strength. He personally led his armies from fort to fort, campaign to campaign, in an increasingly futile effort to crush a resistance that simply melted into the hills whenever the Mughal forces arrived and reappeared the moment they left. The financial cost was devastating. The army grew enormous, but the system designed to pay and supply it was breaking down. The tax burden on ordinary farmers rose to levels they could not bear, driving some regions toward ruin. He died in 1707 at the age of 88, still in a military camp, still waging war after nearly 50 years on the throne. His final letters reveal a man tormented by doubt. He wrote to his son that he had come into the world alone and was leaving it the same way, with nothing. He feared judgment for the way he had seized power and treated his family. He asked to be buried simply in a grave open to the sky, with no grand monument, a final rejection of the lavish building tradition that had defined his dynasty. The empire he left behind fell apart with remarkable speed. A succession war among his sons further weakened the center. And within decades, the emperor in Delhi had become little more than a figurehead. Regional powers filled the gap. The Marathas expanded across central and northern India. Bengal became effectively independent. The ruler of the Deccan carved out his own domain, and the Sikhs solidified their hold on the Punjab. The most devastating symbol of the decline came in 1739, when an invader from Persia crushed the Mughal army, marched into Delhi, and sacked the city for weeks. He carried away the legendary gem-encrusted throne, the famous diamond, and a fortune so vast it had taken a century of empire to accumulate. The later emperors were puppets, installed and removed by whoever happened to control the capital at any given moment. By the middle of the 18th century, the empire, that had once governed 150 million people, effectively controlled nothing beyond the walls of its own fortress. The collapse of the Mughal Empire created the opening into which the European trading companies would step. The same empire that had built the world's most famous monument, patronized some of the greatest art and literature ever produced, and governed one of the most sophisticated states in the pre-modern world had, through its own internal struggles, opened the door to conquest by merchants from a small, cold island on the far edge of Europe. In the summer of 1659, a young warrior agreed to meet a powerful general of a rival sultanate under a flag of truce at the foot of a fort in the Western Ghats. The general had been sent with a large army to crush a growing rebellion, and the meeting was supposedly a peace negotiation. Both men knew it was likely a trap. The young warrior arrived for the customary embrace, wearing a hidden suit of mail beneath his robes, and carrying a concealed weapon, a set of curved iron blades worn over the fingers like a glove. When the general tried to stab him during the embrace, the hidden armor stopped the blow. The warrior struck back, and the general fell. The soldiers waiting in ambush on the hillside then swept down on the leaderless army and scattered it. This act made the young man a legend, a symbol of resistance, and it announced the arrival of a new power that would eventually fill the vacuum left by the fading Mughal Empire and reshape the entire map of India. This warrior was born in 1630 in a hill fort near the city of Junar, in what is now the state of Maharashtra. His father was a nobleman who served various powers in the south, and his mother was a formidable woman who raised him with a fierce devotion to Hindu tradition and an ambition to carve out an independent kingdom. The Western Ghats, the mountain range running along India's western coast, provided perfect ground for his style of warfare. Steep valleys, thick forests, and hundreds of hilltop forts, many of them ancient and nearly impossible to take by assault, offered natural protection against the much larger armies of the Mughal Empire. He developed a style of fighting that relied on speed, surprise, and an intimate knowledge of the land. Rather than meeting the Mughal armies in open battle, where his smaller forces would be at a disadvantage, he used swift cavalry raids. His horsemen could appear out of nowhere, strike a supply train or an isolated garrison, and vanish into the mountains before the main enemy force could react. He built and maintained a network of over 300 forts across the Western Ghats, each commanding a valley, a mountain pass, or a stretch of coastline. He also built something that had not been seen before in Indian history, a naval force that could challenge the Portuguese, the Mughals, and the English for control of the Western Sea. His most dramatic adventure was his confrontation with the Mughal emperor himself. Traveling to the imperial court, he was insulted by being placed among minor nobles, rather than being received with the respect he felt his victories deserved. When the emperor essentially held him prisoner, he engineered a daring escape, reportedly concealing himself in a large basket of gifts that was carried out by his own servants. Whether this story is exactly true or a later embellishment, his escape from the heart of Mughal power and his safe return home deeply embarrassed the emperor and cemented his reputation as a figure of almost mythical cunning. In 1674, he crowned himself as paramount sovereign in an elaborate ceremony at a hilltop fortress, deliberately proclaiming the establishment of an independent Hindu kingdom, free from both Mughal and Sultanate authority. The ceremony included a council of 8 ministers modeled on ancient Hindu traditions of governance. He died in 1680 at the age of 50. His son was captured and brutally killed by the Mughals, but rather than crushing the movement, this cruelty only strengthened it. The resistance continued under other family members, including women who proved themselves equally capable military leaders. The real expansion of Maratha power came after the Mughal emperor's death in 1707, led by a line of hereditary prime ministers who became the true power behind the throne. The most brilliant of these was a cavalry commander who in just 20 years expanded the territory controlled by the Marathas from roughly 3% to about 30% of the entire subcontinent. His lightning-fast horsemen carried Maratha power from the southern mountains to the gates of Delhi itself. The Maratha Confederacy, as it became known, was an unusual political arrangement, a loose alliance of semi-independent chiefs united under the leadership of the Prime Minister at Pune. This structure gave the Marathas enormous military reach, but also left them vulnerable to internal rivalries and an inability to coordinate against a truly unified enemy. That weakness proved fatal at one of the largest and bloodiest battles of the 18th century, fought on the same plains of Panipat, where the Mughal Empire had been founded more than 2 centuries earlier. In 1761, a vast Maratha army faced the invading forces of an Afghan ruler. The battle was a catastrophe. Tens of thousands of Maratha soldiers were killed in a single day, along with many of their best leaders. The dream of the Marathas replacing the Mughals as the supreme power in India was shattered. The Confederacy recovered to some degree, but it never regained the momentum it needed to dominate the subcontinent. The real winners of the Maratha weakening were the British, whose trading company had been quietly building its own power in Bengal, Madras, and Bombay, while the Indian powers fought among themselves. Within 50 years of that devastating battle, the British had dismantled the Maratha Confederacy entirely. But the legacy of this warrior endures as one of the most powerful symbols in Indian political life. He is celebrated as a national hero who established self-rule in the face of overwhelming odds. The tradition of resistance he forged in the forts and valleys of the Western Ghats became a model for later movements against foreign domination, and his story continues to inspire fierce pride and passionate debate in India to this day. On a June day in 1757, in a mango grove beside a river in Bengal, at a place called Plassey, a battle was fought that would change the fate of the Indian subcontinent more profoundly than any event since the first humans walked its soil over 1 million years ago. On one side stood the young ruler of Bengal with perhaps 50,000 soldiers and heavy cannons. On the other stood an agent of the English East India Company with about 3,000 men. By any reasonable calculation, the ruler should have won easily. But this battle was decided not by skill or courage, but by betrayal. The company agent had bribed the commander of the Bengali army to switch sides. When the fighting began, more than half of the defenders' forces simply stood still while the company attacked. By the end of the day, the richest province in India had fallen under the control of a business corporation headquartered in London. The East India Company had come to India as a humble trading venture. Granted a royal charter at the very end of the year 1600, it was originally interested in nothing more than buying Indian cloth, spices, and dyes for resale in European markets. Its first trading post, a modest operation, was established on the western coast in 1613. Over the following decades, more posts appeared along the coasts. For a century and a half, the company operated within the framework of Mughal authority, paying tribute, seeking permits, and conducting itself as one business among many in the vast and prosperous Indian marketplace. The Mughal Empire, with its 100 million people and its sophisticated government, had no reason to be afraid of a few thousand foreign merchants. But the collapse of Mughal power changed everything. The company saw its opportunity and seized it. After Plassey, it installed a puppet ruler in Bengal and extracted enormous financial concessions. When this puppet proved troublesome, they replaced him with another. When the replacement tried to assert his independence, they defeated him too, this time at a battle far more significant than Plassey, because the enemy included not just the local ruler, but the Mughal emperor himself. After this victory, the company received the right to collect taxes across Bengal, Bihar, and the surrounding regions, gaining control of the revenue of the richest territory in India. What followed was one of the great economic disasters in human history. The company immediately raised taxes by at least 20%. Its agents took over the internal trade in essential goods, driving Indian merchants out of business. Indian producers were forced to sell their goods to the company at prices far below what they were worth. The worst consequences came in 1770, when a drought triggered a famine in Bengal that killed an estimated 1 to 10 million people, perhaps a quarter of the population. The company did not cause the drought, but its policies turned a natural disaster into a catastrophe of almost unimaginable proportions. Tax collection was not reduced during the famine. In fact, it was increased. Company agents bought rice for the army while people starved. Merchants in the companies employ hoarded grain to drive up prices. The local government, stripped of its power and its money, could do nothing. Bengal, which had been one of the wealthiest places on earth when the company arrived, was reduced to a landscape of abandoned villages and unburied dead. This pattern was repeated across India as the company expanded its control through a combination of military force, diplomatic trickery, and the exploitation of rivalries among Indian rulers. A system of so-called subsidiary alliances forced Indian kings to accept British garrisons in their territories, pay for those garrisons, and hand over control of their foreign relations. In exchange, the rulers received the appearance of power, while slowly being drained of real authority and revenue. The economic transformation was devastating on a scale that is difficult to grasp. India at the beginning of the 18th century had been the world's leading manufacturer of cotton cloth, with an estimated share of about a quarter of the entire world's economic output. The company's policies systematically destroyed this manufacturing base. Raw cotton was shipped from India to factories in England, turned into cloth by machines, and then sold back to India, protected by tariffs that Indian producers could not overcome. The weavers of Bengal, whose cloth had once been celebrated across the world as the finest ever made, found their livelihoods destroyed by factory-produced imports. In the great weaving city of Dhaka, the population collapsed as the industry that had sustained it disappeared. An Indian thinker later calculated the extent of this systematic extraction in a landmark study that helped spark the nationalist movement. Modern scholars have estimated the total wealth transferred from India to Britain over the entire colonial period at a figure so vast, measured in the trillions, that it nearly defies comprehension. By the middle of the 19th century, a commercial venture that had started with a few hundred merchants in a coastal trading post now governed more than 200 million people, maintained one of the largest armies in the world, and controlled a territory larger than any European state. It was the most extraordinary example in all of history of a private business acquiring power over an entire civilization, and its legacy would shape India for generations to come. But the people of India would not endure this forever. A rebellion was coming, and when it arrived, it would shake the foundations of the empire itself. On the evening of May 10th, 1857, in a military town about 70 kilometers northeast of Delhi, 85 Indian soldiers sat in chains in a garrison jail. They had been sentenced to 10 years of hard labor for refusing to bite the cartridges of a new type of rifle, which they believed were coated with the fat of cows and pigs, substances that would be deeply offensive to both Hindu and Muslim soldiers. The spectacle of their punishment, the public humiliation, the stripping of uniforms, the clamping of irons, had been meant to frighten others into obedience. Instead, it lit a fire that would become the largest armed uprising against British rule in the history of the colonial world. The next morning, soldiers of the cavalry broke open the jail, freed the prisoners, and turned their weapons on their British officers. The violence spread rapidly. By midday, the soldiers had mounted their horses and were riding south toward Delhi to offer their loyalty to the man they considered the rightful ruler of India, an 81-year-old last Mughal emperor who lived as a British pensioner in the crumbling splendor of the Red Fort, spending his days writing poetry and tending his garden. When the soldiers reached Delhi the following morning, the old emperor, bewildered and frightened, was essentially pushed into becoming the symbolic leader of a rebellion he had not wanted and could not control. Within weeks, the uprising had spread across a vast stretch of northern and central India, engulfing major cities and drawing in people from every walk of life. The causes ran far deeper than the cartridges, though that grievance was real enough. The British had systematically offended almost every part of Indian society. A policy called the Doctrine of Lapse had allowed the company to seize any kingdom whose ruler died without a natural male heir, ignoring the long Indian tradition of adoption. Under this rule, the company had swallowed up one kingdom after another, dispossessing families that had governed for generations. Among those stripped of their inheritance was a queen whose story would become one of the most celebrated in all of Indian history. Born around 1828, she had married the ruler of a central Indian kingdom. When her husband died, the British refused to recognize her adopted son and annexed her land. When the rebellion came, she joined it and proved herself a military leader of remarkable skill. She defended her city against a British siege, escaped when it fell, and rode to another fortress where she helped capture it from a British allied ruler. She died in battle, struck by a shot while fighting in full armor with her infant son strapped to her back. Even the British officers who fought against her admitted her courage, and their commander reportedly called her the most dangerous of all the Indian leaders. At another city, the rebellion took a terrible turn when captured British soldiers and their families were massacred. This atrocity inflamed public opinion in Britain and was used to justify the horrifying reprisals that followed. The British response was savage beyond description. When they recaptured Delhi after a siege of several months, the violence was indiscriminate. Suspected rebels were tied to the mouths of cannons and blown apart. Villages were burned. Mass hangings were carried out with barely any pretense of a trial. The old emperor was captured, tried, and exiled to a distant city in Burma, where he died a few years later, the last of a dynasty that had ruled India for more than 3 centuries. His sons and grandsons were shot while surrendering. The rebellion was crushed by the middle of 1858, though scattered resistance continued beyond that. The consequences were far-reaching. The East India Company, which had governed India for a century, was formally dissolved, and control of India was transferred directly to the British Crown. A royal proclamation promised religious tolerance, respect for Indian customs and equal treatment under the law, promises that would largely remain unfulfilled. The Indian army was completely reorganized to ensure that Indian soldiers could never again unite against their masters. The uprising holds a contested place in Indian memory. The British called it a mutiny, reducing it to a breakdown of military discipline. Indian nationalists later reclaimed it as the First Great War of Independence, though some historians argue that this overstates the unity and political awareness of those who participated. What is beyond argument is that the rebellion exposed the fundamental fragility of British control, showed that Indian resistance could shake the most powerful empire on earth, and created figures of courage whose stories would inspire the freedom movement that would eventually succeed where the rebels of 1857 had failed. The old world of rulers and princes, of Mughal ceremony and company commerce, of Hindu and Muslim kings negotiating with foreign merchants, had come to an end. In its place rose the British Raj, a new order that would remake India in ways both creative and destructive over the next 90 years. And it is to that era of railways, famines, and the slow awakening of a national consciousness that we now turn. On an April day in 1853, a steam locomotive pulled 14 carriages carrying 400 passengers from Bombay to a neighboring town, a distance of about 34 kilometers. It was the first passenger railway journey in the history of India, and the crowd that gathered treated it as an event of almost supernatural significance. A 21-gun salute marked the departure. The British authorities presented the railway as a gift of progress to a land they considered backward. The reality was more complicated. The Indian Railway Network, which would eventually stretch over 60,000 kilometers and become one of the largest in the world, was built primarily to serve British interests, to move raw materials from the interior to the ports for export, to carry British troops quickly to trouble spots, and to generate profits for British investors who were guaranteed a minimum return on their money by the Indian government. The railways did transform India, but the transformation was designed to benefit Britain. The 90 years of direct British rule reshaped nearly every aspect of Indian life. The economy, the legal system, the schools, the language, the social structure, the very way Indians thought about themselves and their place in the world, all of it was changed. Some of these changes were genuinely useful, many were catastrophically harmful. And the debate over the balance of the colonial experience remains one of the most charged questions in Indian life today. The economic damage was devastating by any honest measure. India, at the start of the 18th century, had accounted for roughly a quarter of the world's total economic output. By 1950, 3 years after independence, India's share had fallen to about 4%. This staggering decline was not an accident or a natural development. It was the result of deliberate policy. The systematic destruction of Indian manufacturing, particularly the great textile industry, transformed the subcontinent from the world's leading producer of cotton goods into a supplier of raw cotton and a captive market for British factory-made cloth. The weavers who had once produced fabric desired by every civilization on Earth were reduced to farming. The record of famine under British rule is one of the most damning indictments of colonialism anywhere in the world. Between 1770 and 1947, India experienced an estimated 25 to 30 major famines, killing a cumulative total of perhaps 30 to 60 million people. During these famines, India continued to export grain to Britain, a fact that modern historians have pointed to as evidence that British policy did not merely fail to prevent starvation, but actively caused it. The mechanisms were straightforward. British land revenue policies demanded payment in cash, at rates that left no margin for bad harvests. When crops failed, farmers were forced to sell their grain reserves to meet tax obligations. The railways that the British had built carried grain from famine areas to wherever the highest price could be found, which was usually the export ports. The prevailing British economic belief that the government should not interfere in the market amounted to a death sentence for millions of Indians who could not afford to compete with foreign buyers for their own food. And yet, the British also introduced structures that would outlast their rule. A legal code drafted in the 1860s remains the basis of Indian criminal law to this day. A civil service modelled on the British system created an institutional framework for governing a vast country. a court system based on principles of individual rights and due process, however imperfectly applied under colonial rule, would become part of the foundation of the independent Indian state. The education system was reshaped by a British official who openly dismissed the entire literary heritage of India and Arabia as worth less than a single shelf of European books. His stated goal was the creation of a class of people who were Indian in appearance, but English in their thinking, a class that would serve as translators between the British rulers and the millions they governed. The result was a two-track system: English language schools for a small elite who would staff the colonial administration, and near total neglect of schooling for everyone else, leaving India at independence with a literacy rate of roughly 12%. But this English education produced consequences the British had not intended. The Indians who studied in English schools and travelled to Britain for higher education encountered the very ideas of freedom, democracy, and self-determination that the British applied to themselves, but denied to their colonial subjects. It was precisely these English-educated Indians who would form the leadership of the movement for independence, using the British's own arguments and principles to demand that they be applied consistently. The railways, the telegraph, the printing press, the English language, the legal system, the very concept of a nation-state, all of these were introduced or dramatically expanded under British rule, and every one of them was a double-edged sword. The railways that carried troops to suppress rebellions also carried nationalist leaders to rallies. The presses that printed government proclamations also printed revolutionary pamphlets. The English language, meant to create a submissive administrative class, instead gave Indians from different regions a common tongue in which to organize, communicate, and imagine themselves as one nation. The British Raj, in its very effort to control India, was creating the tools India would use to become free. On a September afternoon in 1893, in the city of Chicago, a young Hindu monk in orange robes and a turban stood before an audience of 7,000 people at a great gathering of the world's religions and opened his address with 5 simple words: "Sisters and Brothers of America." The audience erupted in a standing ovation that lasted 2 full minutes before he could continue. In a country where Hinduism was widely dismissed as a collection of primitive superstitions, this monk presented it as a profound tradition of universal tolerance and spiritual wisdom. His address, and the lectures that followed during his travels across America and Europe, did more than introduce Hinduism to the Western world. They gave Indians themselves a new sense of pride, at a time when colonial rule had convinced many that their civilization was inherently inferior. This monk was part of a broader awakening sweeping through Indian thought in the late 19th century, a ferment of ideas that would eventually crystallize into the nationalist movement that brought down the British Empire. The awakening had many dimensions: social reform, religious revival, cultural confidence, and political organization, and it drew on both Indian traditions and Western ideas in a way that defied easy label. The roots of this awakening can be traced to a remarkable figure born in 1772, a Bengali thinker who mastered multiple languages, studied the sacred texts of Hinduism, Islam, and Christianity with equal seriousness, and concluded that all religions contained the same essential truths beneath their outer differences. He campaigned against the burning of widows, against child marriage, and against many old practices that he saw as corruptions rather than traditions. He founded schools that taught both Indian and Western subjects, and he created a reformed religious movement that rejected the caste system and the worship of images. His work helped bring about the banning of the practice of widows dying on funeral pyres in 1829, the first major piece of social legislation enacted by the British in India. The founding of the Indian National Congress in 1885 marked a decisive moment. It was the first organization to claim to speak for Indians as a whole, across all the dividing lines of region, religion, language, and caste. There is an irony in its birth. The idea came from a retired British official who believed that an organized, moderate Indian political body would act as a safety valve for discontent and prevent another uprising. He could not have imagined what it would eventually become. The early Congress was polite and careful in its demands. Its members, mostly English-educated lawyers, journalists, and teachers, asked for greater Indian representation in government, reduction of military spending, reform of the civil service, and the separation of legal and administrative functions. They believed, for the most part, that British rule could be improved from within, and that patient argument and good behavior would gradually win Indians the same rights that British citizens enjoyed at home. But a division was already emerging that would define Indian politics for a generation. On one side stood those who believed in gradual reform through constitutional means, those who argued that Indians could earn self-governance by demonstrating their fitness for it. On the other stood those who rejected this approach as servile, who insisted that self-rule was a birthright that did not require British permission. The famous declaration, "Self-rule is my birthright, and I shall have it," became the rallying cry of the more militant wing. The event that transformed Indian nationalism from a debating society into a mass movement was the division of the great province of Bengal in 1905. The British Viceroy split this enormous province into a Hindu-majority west and a Muslim-majority east, officially for administrative convenience. Indians saw it for what it was, a deliberate attempt to divide and weaken Bengali political influence along religious lines. The response was a campaign of economic nationalism that called for the boycott of British goods and the promotion of Indian-made products. Across Bengal and beyond, students burned imported cloth, merchants pledged to sell only Indian goods, and entrepreneurs established Indian-owned factories and banks. This movement was important not only for its economic impact, but for the cultural energy it unleashed. It inspired a flowering of Bengali literature, music, and art that celebrated Indian identity and rejected the sense of inferiority that colonialism had fostered. The great poet and writer, who would later become the first Asian to win the Nobel Prize for Literature, composed songs for this movement that expressed a vision of Indian nationhood rooted in cultural pride. One of his songs, written in response to the division of Bengal, would eventually become the national anthem of Bangladesh. The partition of Bengal was reversed in 1911, a victory for the nationalists, but one that came at a cost. The years of agitation had created a generation of young Indians who were more radical than their elders, some of whom turned to revolutionary violence. Secret groups carried out targeted killings and robberies to fund their operations, drawing inspiration from revolutionary movements in Ireland, Russia, and elsewhere. The British responded with laws that allowed imprisonment without trial, measures that would provoke the next great crisis between India and its rulers. Meanwhile, the argument within Congress about how to win freedom, through patience or through confrontation, reflected a deeper question that would take decades to resolve. That question would find its most original and transformative answer in a South African lawyer who returned to India in 1915, a man who would combine moral conviction with militant spirit into a force more powerful than either. His method was the practice of truth force, the power of standing firm without violence, and his arrival would change everything. On the morning of March 12, 1930, a thin, bespectacled man of 61 years, wearing nothing but a simple white cloth and carrying a wooden walking stick, stepped out of his small community on the banks of a river near Ahmedabad and began to walk. With him walked 78 followers, carefully chosen from different regions, castes, and religions, a small picture of the India they were fighting for. Their destination was a coastal village called Dandi, nearly 400 kilometers to the south, and their purpose was breathtakingly simple: to pick up a handful of salt from the seashore, an act that defied the British salt tax, one of the most resented symbols of colonial control. The march took 24 days, and by the time the man reached the coast and bent down to lift a lump of natural salt from the mudflats, thousands had joined the procession, and millions more across India were watching. Within weeks, Indians along every coastline in the country were making their own salt in open defiance of the law. Over 80,000 people were arrested. The mightiest empire on earth had been challenged by a man who picked up a handful of salt, and the world would never look at colonial power quite the same way again. This man had arrived at this moment through one of the most extraordinary personal transformations in modern history. Born in 1869 in a coastal town in Gujarat, he was the son of a local official, a boy of ordinary abilities who married at 13 and sailed to London at 18 to study law. Nothing in his early life suggested the figure he would become. He was painfully shy, a middling student, and by his own account a young man of conventional ambitions. The change began in South Africa, where he went to work as a lawyer and immediately faced the racial discrimination that defined life for Indians in the British colonies. In a story that has become foundational to his legend, he was thrown off a first-class train carriage because a white passenger objected to sharing the compartment with a person of color, despite the young lawyer holding a valid ticket. That night, shivering in a cold waiting room, he later said he made the decision that would define his life. He would not accept injustice, but he would resist it without violence. Over 21 years in South Africa, he developed his philosophy and his method. He called it truth force, a term he coined from two words in Sanskrit, meaning truth and firmness. This was not passive acceptance. It was active confrontation with injustice, a method that required the practitioner to accept suffering upon themselves rather than cause it to others, in the belief that this willing acceptance of pain would awaken the conscience of the oppressor. It was, in a sense, a kind of moral leverage that turned the power of the one doing wrong against himself. He returned to India in 1915 and spent his first years traveling the country, learning the conditions of ordinary life under British rule. His early campaigns, supporting exploited farmers in one place and organizing peasants against unfair taxes in another, showed that his method could work on Indian soil and built his reputation as a leader who understood the suffering of common people. His first national campaign, launched in 1920, called on Indians to stop cooperating with British institutions, to leave the British courts, schools and legislatures, and to stop buying British goods. The response was massive, but when a crowd of his own supporters set fire to a police station and killed the officers inside, he was so horrified by the violence that he immediately called off the entire movement, a decision that bewildered and angered many of his followers who felt they were on the verge of success. But for him, the principle was absolute. Any departure from non-violence cancelled the moral force of the entire effort. The Salt March of 1930 was his masterpiece. The British salt tax was a perfect target because it affected every Indian, because it was obviously unfair, and because defying it required no violence at all, just the simple act of picking up salt. He planned the march with brilliant attention to public perception, notifying the press in advance, ensuring journalists travelled with the marchers, and timing the journey to build dramatic tension over 24 days of walking. The images that travelled around the world of a frail, elderly man walking through the Indian countryside, followed by growing crowds, created a story of moral courage against imperial might that no amount of British propaganda could overcome. His relationship with the great champion of India's most oppressed communities was one of the most important and most difficult in Indian political history. The champion of the lower castes argued that the caste system was the central injustice of Indian life, worse even than British colonialism, and that the most disadvantaged communities needed their own separate political voice. Gandhi disagreed, fearing that separate political systems would divide Hindu society and weaken the independence movement. When the British offered such a separate system, Gandhi went on a fast, pledging to die unless a compromise was reached. The compromise gave the oppressed communities more reserved seats within a joint system, but the champion of those communities never forgave what he saw as moral pressure used to override the interests of the weakest. The tension between these two visions of India remains one of the defining divisions in Indian life today. The final great campaign came during the Second World War, when Gandhi demanded the immediate departure of the British with the words "do or die." The British arrested virtually the entire leadership of the independence movement within hours. The campaign was largely crushed, but it made clear beyond any doubt that Indian cooperation with British rule could no longer be taken for granted. The years that followed brought independence tantalizingly close, but also the communal violence that shattered Gandhi's dream of a united India. The demand for a separate Muslim state and the failure to agree on power sharing made partition increasingly unavoidable. Gandhi opposed it with every fibre of his being, but he could not prevent it. In the months after independence, he devoted himself to calming the violence, walking through neighborhoods torn by rioting, fasting for peace, visiting refugee camps. His willingness to protect Muslims enraged Hindu nationalists. On January 30th, 1948, while walking to a prayer meeting, he was shot and killed by a man who believed he had betrayed the Hindu majority. In a terrible and final irony, his death proved the very thing he had spent his life teaching, that the deepest enemy of India was not any foreign power, but the hatred within Indian society itself. At the stroke of midnight, as the 14th of August turned into the 15th in 1947, a man named Jawaharlal Nehru rose to address the assembly in the Parliament building in New Delhi. His voice, calm and measured, carried the weight of centuries of longing and the hopes of 400 million people. Long years ago, he said, "We made a tryst with destiny, and now the time comes when we shall redeem our pledge." Outside, the streets erupted. Firecrackers lit the sky. Crowds sang and danced, and the Indian flag was raised over buildings that had flown a foreign flag for nearly a century. India was free. But even as the celebrations unfolded in the capital, trains packed with refugees were already streaming in both directions across borders that had not even been officially published yet. And in the villages of the Punjab and Bengal, neighbor was turning against neighbor in a wave of violence that would claim over 1 million lives and uproot 15 million people. Independence and catastrophe arrived together, born of the same midnight. The road to this moment had been paved with decisions made under impossible pressure. The Second World War had fatally weakened Britain's ability to hold on to its empire. A mutiny among Indian sailors, who seized ships and turned their guns toward the city of Bombay, had shown that the armed forces could no longer be relied upon to keep India under control. The British government concluded that withdrawal was inevitable. The question was not whether the British would leave, but what they would leave behind. The Congress Party, led by Nehru and Gandhi, wanted a united, secular India. The Muslim League, led by Muhammad Ali Jinnah, insisted that India's Muslims, roughly a quarter of the population, could not be safe in a democracy dominated by the Hindu majority and demanded a separate Muslim state. These two positions could not be reconciled, and the failure of every attempt at compromise made the splitting of the country increasingly certain. Violence had already reached staggering levels before the formal division. In the summer of 1946, a day intended to demonstrate Muslim support for a separate state turned into 4 days of rioting in Calcutta that left over 4,000 dead and 100,000 homeless. The violence spread from city to city, each round of killing producing reprisals that fed the next cycle. Gandhi walked barefoot through villages torn apart by hatred, pleading for peace. But the forces of anger had their own momentum. In March of 1947, the last British viceroy arrived with orders to oversee the transfer of power. He had originally planned to take about a year, but the escalating violence convinced him that delay would only make things worse. He moved the date forward to August 15th, giving the new nations barely 5 months to prepare for one of the most complex political transformations in human history. The most fateful task was the drawing of the border. A British lawyer who had never visited India and knew almost nothing about the subcontinent was given 5 weeks to draw a line that would divide two of India's most densely populated and diverse provinces, the Punjab in the west and Bengal in the east, between the two new nations. Working from outdated maps and census data, he made decisions that would determine whether entire communities found themselves in India or Pakistan based on the religious makeup of their district. The Punjab, where Hindus, Muslims and Sikhs had lived intertwined for centuries, was cut in two. The great city of Lahore went to Pakistan. The holy city of Amritsar went to India. Bengal was split between a Hindu west and a Muslim east. The borders were not made public until 2 days after independence, which meant that on the day of freedom itself, millions of people did not know which country they lived in. The consequences were catastrophic. In the Punjab, where the new line sliced through communities that had shared villages, wells, and markets for generations, the violence reached a level that shocked even those who had expected the worst. Entire trainloads of refugees were attacked, arriving at their destinations carrying only the dead. The estimates of those killed range from several 100,000 to 2 million. The number displaced, 15 million, makes it the largest mass migration in human history. Gandhi, who had opposed partition to the very end, spent Independence Day not in Delhi celebrating but in Calcutta, fasting and praying in a desperate effort to stop the killing. His presence in that city, and his willingness to die for peace, is credited with preventing Calcutta from experiencing the bloodbath that consumed the Punjab. One observer called his solitary effort more effective than the 55,000 troops deployed elsewhere. The partition of India remains one of the deepest wounds of the 20th century, a wound that has never fully healed. It showed with terrible clarity the dangers of dividing people along religious lines, the catastrophic consequences of decisions made in haste under political pressure, and the fragility of the bonds that hold diverse communities together. But the very fact that India emerged from this trauma as a functioning democracy, committed in its founding documents to equality, secularism, and the protection of the weak, is itself a testament to the vision of those who, in the darkest hours of the midnight, dared to imagine something better. On January 26, 1950, in a ceremony in the capital, the Constitution of India came into force, and the newly independent nation formally became a republic. The document adopted that day was the longest written constitution in the world, a monumental work of legal architecture that attempted to put into words the hopes of a civilization containing more diversity than the entire continent of Europe. Its principal author was a man born into the lowest rung of the caste system, who had overcome social barriers of almost unimaginable cruelty to become one of the most brilliant legal minds in Indian history. The fact that a person from the most oppressed community was entrusted with writing the supreme law of a nation that had practiced caste discrimination for thousands of years was itself a revolutionary statement about the kind of country India intended to become. This principal author brought to the task a legal education from some of the finest universities in the world, a vast knowledge of constitutional law from many countries, and the personal experience of oppression that gave him a sharp understanding of why rights needed not merely to be promised, but to be protected with the full force of law. The Indian constitution drew from the best traditions of many nations, the parliamentary system from Britain, fundamental rights from America, guiding principles of policy from Ireland, and the ideals of liberty, equality, and fellowship from France. But it was also unmistakably Indian, addressing the specific challenges of a society divided by caste, religion, language, and region. It abolished untouchability, guaranteed religious freedom, and created the world's most extensive system of reserved seats and protections for historically disadvantaged communities. Perhaps the most daring provision of all was universal adult suffrage, the right of every adult citizen to vote. India in 1950 had a literacy rate of roughly 18%. The vast majority of its people were poor, rural, and had never participated in any form of democratic government. Every democracy that came before India had restricted the right to vote at its founding, usually to property-owning men, and had expanded it only gradually over decades or centuries. India gave the vote to everyone on the very first day, an act of faith in ordinary people that had no precedent in human history. The first general election, held over 4 months in 1951 and 52, was a logistical marvel. Over 170 million people were eligible to vote. Election officials traveled by elephant, camel, and boat to reach the most remote villages. Ballot boxes were carried up mountain passes and floated down rivers. The election was conducted peacefully, the results were accepted, and power was transferred accordingly. The world's largest democracy had held its first vote and survived. The man who led this experiment was Jawaharlal Nehru, a product of privilege who had been educated at some of the finest schools in England, but who had also spent a total of 9 years in British prisons for his role in the freedom struggle. He brought to the task of governing a vision of India as a modern, secular, democratic, and scientifically advanced nation. The challenge he faced was staggering. India in 1947 was not a nation in any conventional sense. It was a patchwork of British provinces and over 500 princely states, some the size of European countries and some no larger than a few villages. The task of bringing all these states into a unified country fell to a man of iron determination who used persuasion, pressure, and occasional threats of force to convince the princely rulers to join. Most signed without resistance. A few held out. The ruler of one great southern kingdom, reputed to be the richest man in the world, refused to join India and tried to maintain independence. The Indian army marched in and settled the question. Another disputed territory, claimed by both India and Pakistan, remains contested to this very day. Nehru's economic vision was shaped by his belief that a desperately poor country could not afford the chaos of unregulated markets. He launched a series of plans modeled loosely on the idea of state-led development, with the government taking the leading role in building heavy industry, infrastructure, and scientific research. Great dams were built, which Nehru called the temples of modern India. Steel plants were constructed, and he invested heavily in scientific and technical education, founding a network of engineering colleges, the first established in a former British prisoner of war camp, a symbolism that was not lost on anyone. He created institutions for nuclear research and space science that would eventually make India a nuclear power and a spacefaring nation. But his economic approach also created problems. A system of government licenses and controls, in which officials decided which businesses could operate and what they could produce, became known as the License Raj. A tangle of permits and regulations that stifled enterprise, bred corruption, and locked India into an economic growth rate of about 3.5% per year, a pace that barely kept ahead of the growing population. In foreign policy, Nehru chose a path of non-alignment, steering between the Western and Soviet blocs during the Cold War, and positioning India as the voice of the newly independent nations of the world. This gave India a moral authority that far exceeded its economic or military strength. But the policy was badly shaken in 1962 when Chinese forces attacked across the disputed Himalayan border and inflicted a humiliating defeat on the Indian army. The war shattered Nehru's confidence and damaged India's standing. He never fully recovered from the shock, and he died in 1964, leaving behind a democratic tradition that, for all its imperfections, had survived its most crucial early years and established itself as the foundation of the Indian state. On the night of December 3, 1971, the Indian Air Force struck 11 enemy airfields simultaneously, beginning a war that would last just 13 days and end with the largest military surrender since the Second World War. The conflict was about the people of East Pakistan, who had been subjected to a campaign of systematic violence by their own government. When the opposing army surrendered at Dhaka on December 16th, with 93,000 soldiers laying down their arms, the nation of Bangladesh was born, and the Prime Minister who had guided the campaign, Indira Gandhi, stood at the peak of her power. She was hailed across the country as a figure of almost divine triumph. 4 years later, she would declare an emergency that suspended Indian democracy itself. The decades between the mid-1960s and the early 1990s were the most turbulent in the history of independent India, marked by wars, political crises, assassinations, communal violence, and the constant testing of the democratic institutions that the founders had built. At the center of this turbulence stood the Nehru-Gandhi family, beginning with Indira, the daughter of Jawaharlal Nehru, who became Prime Minister in 1966 and dominated Indian politics for nearly 2 decades. She inherited a country weakened by the aftermath of the war with China, a brief war with Pakistan in 1965, and 2 consecutive years of severe drought that had brought India to the edge of famine. Her early years in office were marked by fierce political battles within her own party, which she eventually split, reaching over the heads of the party bosses with a direct appeal to the poor under the slogan "Abolish Poverty." The Bangladesh crisis brought her qualities into sharp focus. When the military government of Pakistan unleashed violence against its own eastern population, driving 10 million refugees across the border into India, she spent months building international support and preparing her military for a decisive response. When Pakistan launched a preemptive strike on Indian airfields, providing the justification for intervention, the Indian forces executed a brilliant 2-week campaign that achieved total victory. The creation of Bangladesh was her greatest achievement. But the qualities that made her effective in a crisis, her ruthlessness, her impatience with opposition, her instinct for concentrating power, made her dangerous in normal times. By 1975, with the economy in trouble and a popular movement demanding her resignation, a court ruled that she had been guilty of misconduct in elections. Instead of stepping down, she declared a state of emergency, suspending civil liberties, censoring the press, and imprisoning thousands of political opponents without trial. Over the next 21 months, India was governed as an authoritarian state. Her younger son, who held no elected office, wielded enormous unofficial power, driving a forced sterilization campaign that affected millions of the poorest and most vulnerable. The emergency was the darkest moment in the history of Indian democracy, but it also demonstrated the resilience of the institutions that Nehru had built. When Indira Gandhi, apparently confident of victory, called elections in 1977, the Indian people delivered a devastating judgment. She was swept from power in a landslide. The peaceful transfer of authority from an authoritarian government back to a democratic one, accomplished through the ballot box rather than through violence, was perhaps the most remarkable moment in the entire story of Indian democracy. She returned to power in 1980 after the replacement government collapsed in infighting, but the Punjab was descending into crisis. A Sikh militant movement, originally encouraged by her own party as a political tool, had spiraled out of control. In June of 1984, she ordered a full military assault on the holiest shrine of the Sikh faith, where the militants had fortified themselves. The operation killed the militant leader and his followers, but the damage to Sikh feeling was deep and lasting. Hundreds of civilians sheltering in the complex were killed. Sikhs around the world were outraged. On October 31, 1984, she was shot and killed by 2 of her own Sikh bodyguards. The assassination triggered days of organized violence against Sikh communities across northern India, with mobs systematically attacking homes, businesses, and places of worship. Thousands were killed. Evidence of political involvement in directing the violence has been the subject of investigations and legal proceedings that continue to this day. Her elder son, Rajiv Gandhi, a former airline pilot, with no prior political experience, was sworn in within hours and won a massive electoral victory on a wave of sympathy. He brought a modern, technical vision to his leadership, beginning the process of easing economic controls and investing in technology. But his government was damaged by corruption scandals, and his decision to send Indian troops to Sri Lanka entangled the country in a foreign civil war. He lost power in 1989, and in 1991, while campaigning for a return to office, he was killed by a suicide bomber. The deaths of mother and son, both assassinated by the very forces they had tried to manage, stand as terrible reminders of the violent currents running beneath the surface of Indian life. The era they defined was one of achievement and crisis, of democratic strength and authoritarian temptation, of national pride and communal horror. But through it all, the Indian Republic survived, battered and scarred, still democratic, still committed to the constitutional vision of its founders, and now approaching the most dramatic economic transformation in its history. In the summer of 1991, the Republic of India was on the edge of bankruptcy. Its foreign reserves had dwindled to an amount that could cover barely 2 weeks of essential imports. The country was spending more on interest payments to foreign lenders than it earned from exports. As a condition of an emergency loan, India was required to pledge 20 tons of gold from its reserves, gold that was physically flown to London as security. For a nation that had spent decades fighting free of colonial economic control, the sight of Indian gold being shipped to the old imperial capital was a humiliation that seared the national memory. But from this crisis would come a transformation so profound that it would alter the economic life of 1 billion people. The man who led the transformation was an unlikely figure for a revolution. A soft-spoken economist who had studied at some of the finest universities in England, he had built a quiet reputation as a cautious, methodical thinker. When he rose to present his first budget as finance minister, he quoted a French writer saying that nothing can stop an idea whose time has come. The idea was the dismantling of the vast web of government controls that had constrained Indian business for 40 years, and its replacement with an open economy connected to the world. The changes came quickly. Rules that required government permission to start a business were swept away. Import taxes, which had been among the highest in the world, were dramatically reduced. Foreign investment, previously restricted to minor stakes, was open to majority and even full ownership in many industries. The currency was adjusted. Government monopolies in sectors like communications, aviation, and banking were broken up. The reforms did not happen overnight, and some argued they did not go far enough, but they fundamentally changed India's direction. The numbers tell the story clearly. In the 4 decades before these reforms, India's economy had grown at about 3.5% per year, a pace that economists had mocked as barely keeping ahead of population growth. After the reforms, growth accelerated to 5, 6, 7, and eventually 8% in good years. The Indian middle class, estimated at perhaps 50 million people before the changes, expanded to 300 million or more within a generation. An entire cohort of young Indians grew up in an economy of possibility that their parents could never have imagined. The most visible symbol of the new India was the rise of a pleasant southern city known for its gardens, and mild weather into one of the great technology centers of the world. The foundation had been laid decades earlier by Nehru's investment in technical education. The graduates of India's engineering colleges provided a vast supply of skilled English-speaking workers who could develop software and provide services at a fraction of the cost charged elsewhere. Companies that had started with almost nothing, one famously beginning with a capital of about $250, grew into enterprises worth billions. A global computer crisis at the turn of the millennium, when technology systems around the world needed urgent repair to handle the change of date, became an unexpected gift for the Indian technology industry. Indian companies, with their large teams of programmers and their ability to work through the night while their American clients slept, became essential partners. When the crisis passed, the relationships endured. Within 2 decades, India's technology sector was generating over $200 billion in annual revenue and employing millions. But the benefits were distributed unevenly. The urban middle class and the technology sector flourished, while hundreds of millions of rural farmers were left behind. Caught between rising costs and stagnating prices, many farmers in the cotton-growing regions fell into terrible hardship. A wave of despair swept through agricultural communities. A tragic reminder that economic progress measured by national statistics could mask immense human suffering. The other defining moment of the late 1990s was India's emergence as a declared nuclear power. In May of 1998, several nuclear devices were detonated beneath the desert in Rajasthan. The tests declared India an unambiguous nuclear weapons state. The international reaction was swift, with major powers imposing economic penalties. But within India, there was an overwhelming surge of national pride that crossed party lines. Pakistan responded with its own tests within weeks, making the subcontinent a nuclear-armed region and raising the stakes of the rivalry between the two countries to existential level. The revolution in communications that accompanied the economic opening transformed daily life in ways that statistics alone cannot capture. In 1991, India had fewer than 5 million telephone connections for a population approaching 900 million. By the 2020s, there were over 1 billion mobile phone connections. The spread of cheap smartphones and affordable mobile data connected hundreds of millions of Indians to the internet for the first time, enabling digital payments, online education, and access to government services. A biometric identity system enrolled over 1 billion people, creating the world's largest digital identification program. This digital revolution was, in its own way, as transformative as the railway revolution of the 19th century, connecting Indians to each other and to the world in ways that compressed distance and created entirely new possibilities. The India that entered the 21st century bore little resemblance to the crisis-ridden nation of 1991. It was the 5th largest economy in the world, a nuclear power, a nation that could send spacecraft beyond the Earth, and a democracy that, for all its flaws, continued to hold free elections and transfer power peacefully. But the deepest questions, how to lift hundreds of millions from poverty, how to hold together a diverse society, how to build a future in the face of a changing climate, remained as urgent as ever. In a small theatre in the southern city of Chennai, on a warm evening that could be any evening of the year, a dancer takes the stage. She wears silk woven in one of the old temple towns, gold at her throat and wrists, and bells around her ankles that mark every beat of the music with a precise silver sound. Her feet strike the floor in patterns passed down from teacher to student for centuries, and her hands form gestures that tell stories from the great Indian epics, tales of gods and heroes, of love and sacrifice that have been told on this subcontinent for over 3,000 years. This is one of 8 classical dance forms recognized in India, and its survival into the modern era is itself a story of cultural resistance and revival that mirrors the larger story of Indian civilization. The cultural landscape of India is of a richness and complexity that has no parallel anywhere on Earth. A recent survey identified nearly 800 languages spoken within the borders of the Republic, written in over 60 different scripts. The Constitution recognizes 23 official languages, but this barely scratches the surface of a variety that spans 4 entirely separate language families. A person traveling from the valleys of the far north to the coast of the far south, a distance of roughly 3,000 kilometers, would cross a dozen major language boundaries, each with its own literary tradition stretching back centuries or millennia. The musical traditions are equally ancient and equally diverse. 2 great classical systems have evolved in parallel, one in the north and one in the south. Both are built on the idea of the melodic framework, a structure that prescribes not just a set of notes, but a mood, a time of day, and even a season. Hundreds of such frameworks are recognized, each associated with specific feelings. Some are meant only for the early morning, others only for the late evening, and some are reserved for the monsoon, when their melancholy beauty is said to match the mood of the rain. Can you picture that? A tradition of music so intimately connected to the natural world that the hour and the season determine what may be played. The instruments themselves are works of art and engineering. The stringed instrument most associated with Indian music has a set of extra strings that vibrate in sympathy with the ones being played, creating that characteristic shimmering, ringing sound. The pair of hand drums that provides the rhythmic foundation requires years of dedicated practice to master, and the greatest players can produce sounds of astonishing speed and complexity. One of the oldest instruments associated with the goddess of learning herself appears in stone carvings dating back nearly 2,000 years. It was through the art of a master musician that Indian classical music reached a global audience in the 1960s, through collaborations with Western musicians and performances at the great music festivals of that era. His influence was profound, introducing the concept of the Indian melodic framework to the Western world and creating a model for cross-cultural musical conversation that continues to this day. The literary tradition of India is among the oldest and most vast in the world. The earliest sacred hymns, composed over 3,000 years ago, mark the beginning of a continuous tradition that spans the great epics, the plays and poems of the classical Golden Age, the devotional poetry of medieval saints, and the novels and short stories of modern writers. The Tamil literary tradition is equally ancient, with poetry dating back over 2,000 years that ranks among the finest in any language. In 1913, a Bengali writer became the first person from outside Europe to win the Nobel Prize for Literature. He was a figure of staggering range, a poet, novelist, playwright, painter, musician, philosopher, and educational reformer who composed the national anthems of two countries, India and Bangladesh. His influence on Bengali culture is comparable to that of Shakespeare on the English-speaking world, a presence so vast that it is simply impossible to imagine the one without the other. The Indian film industry is the largest in the world by the number of films produced, releasing somewhere between 1,500 and 2,000 each year in dozens of languages. The industry that is centered in Mumbai and produces films primarily in Hindi is only the most visible part of a vast system that includes critically acclaimed cinema in Tamil, Malayalam, Bengali, Telugu, and many other languages. Indian films develop their own distinctive style, with songs and dances woven into the storytelling, with running times of 3 hours or more, and with a star system in which leading actors inspire a devotion that borders on the religious. The influence of these films extends far beyond India, reaching audiences across the Middle East, Africa, Southeast Asia, and increasingly the rest of the world. Indian food, like every other aspect of Indian culture, varies with breathtaking speed from region to region. The coconut-based preparations of the Southwest bear almost no resemblance to the wheat breads and clay oven dishes of the Northwest, which are in turn completely different from the rice and fish of the East or the fermented crepes and lentil stews of the Deep South. What ties all of this together is the sophisticated use of spices, a tradition rooted in India's ancient role as the spice center of the world. Turmeric, cumin, coriander, cardamom, black pepper, chili, these are the building blocks of an infinite number of regional variations, each household maintaining its own traditions and recipes passed down through generations. The classical dance form that opened this section was nearly lost during the colonial period, when the British classified the temple dancers who had preserved it as immoral, and the dance itself was stigmatized and suppressed. It was revived in the 1930s and 40s by determined women who separated it from its temple context, presented it on the concert stage, and reclaimed it as a treasure of national culture. Today, it is the most widely practiced classical Indian dance both within India and around the world, a living connection to an artistic tradition that stretches back 2,000 years. The cultural tapestry of India is not a museum display, but a living, breathing, constantly evolving reality. Each generation adds new threads, while the old ones continue to vibrate. Classical traditions sit alongside contemporary art, fusion music, experimental theatre, and digital creation. This is the particular genius of Indian civilization, its extraordinary capacity to absorb, adapt, and create. To be simultaneously ancient and modern, traditional and innovative, in a way that is unlike anything else on Earth. On an August evening in 2023, a spacecraft touched down near the south pole of the Moon, and India became the fourth country in history to achieve a soft landing on the lunar surface. What made the achievement particularly striking was the cost. The entire mission had been completed for roughly $74 million, less than the budget of many feature films and a fraction of what comparable missions had cost other space agencies. 2 weeks earlier, a Russian lander attempting to reach the same area had crashed. In the control room in the southern city of Bengaluru, scientists broke into applause and tears, and across India, millions watched the landing on their mobile phones. It was a scene that captured the contradictions and the promise of modern India, a nation that could send a craft to the moon, while hundreds of millions of its people still lacked reliable access to clean water. India's space program has become one of the most powerful symbols of the country's emergence as a force in the 21st century. The program began with a physicist who convinced the nation's first prime minister that a poor country had even more reason than a rich one to invest in space, because the applications in communication, weather forecasting, and mapping could leap over decades of conventional development. The early years were marked by a spirit of improvisation that has come to define Indian engineering. The first rocket was transported to the launch site on a bicycle, and the early satellite components were assembled in a former church. An earlier mission to Mars had captured global attention because India became the first country to reach the Red Planet on its first try, and because the total cost was less than the production budget of a Hollywood film about a fictional space disaster. India's space program has routinely achieved what others spend 10 times more to accomplish. But this program exists within a nation of vast contrasts. India is now the world's fifth largest economy, yet the top 10% of the population holds roughly 3/4 of the national wealth, and over 150 million people still live in poverty. The economic growth that followed the reforms of the early 1990s has been real, lifting hundreds of millions out of the worst deprivation. But it has also widened the gap between the urban, educated middle class and the rural majority. The digital revolution has been one of the great leveling forces. A biometric identity system has enrolled over 1 billion people, giving them a digital identity that opens access to government services and bank accounts. A real-time payment system now processes billions of transactions each month, allowing even street vendors to accept digital payments through their phones. India's digital infrastructure has been recognized around the world as one of the most ambitious examples of technology-driven governance in the developing world. The age of the Indian population is one of its greatest potential strengths and one of its greatest risks. With a median age of about 28, India is the youngest major economy on the planet, in stark contrast to the aging populations of China, Japan, and Europe. If this young population can be educated and employed, it could power decades of growth. But if the jobs do not come, if 10 to 12 million new positions are not created every year to absorb the growing workforce, the result could be social unrest on a massive scale. Religious and communal tensions remain a persistent challenge. The rise of Hindu nationalism has raised deep questions about the relationship between the majority faith and the country's religious minorities, particularly the roughly 200 million Muslims. The debate is fierce. Supporters say that India is finally embracing its civilizational identity. Critics warn that tying national identity to a single religion threatens the pluralistic foundation on which the republic was built. The tension is not new. India has experienced episodes of communal violence throughout its post-independence history. What is new is the degree to which these ideas have been brought into the political mainstream, with consequences that are still unfolding. The threat of climate change looms over everything. India is one of the most vulnerable nations on Earth. 1 billion people depend on the monsoon for water and food. Rising temperatures are already making parts of the north uninhabitable during summer heat waves. The glaciers in the Himalayas, which feed the rivers that sustain hundreds of millions, are retreating. Extreme weather, from devastating floods to increasingly powerful storms, is becoming more frequent. India is simultaneously one of the world's largest sources of emissions and one of the countries that has contributed least to historical emissions on a per-person basis, a contradiction that shapes its complex position in global discussions about the future of the planet. India's growing weight in the world reflects both its economic rise and the strategic calculations of other nations. It has been courted as a counterbalance to the growing power of China, offered partnerships in military technology, nuclear cooperation, and diplomatic support. But India has also maintained its tradition of strategic independence, continuing relationships with many different powers and refusing to align itself unconditionally with any single group. The India of the 21st century is a nation of staggering contrasts, a space power where farmers struggle, a digital leader where millions lack basic sanitation, a vibrant democracy where press freedom faces pressure, a rising global force where ancient forms of discrimination persist. These contradictions are not new. They are the continuation of a story that stretches back 5,000 years. The story of a civilization that has always contained multitudes, that has always been simultaneously magnificent and troubled, and that has never stopped surprising the world with its capacity for both creation and endurance. In the city of Varanasi, on the western bank of the Ganges, a scene unfolds every evening that has been repeating, in one form or another, for over 3,000 years. As the sun sets behind the wide stone stairways that descend to the river's edge, priests in saffron robes perform a ceremony of fire, lifting great brass lamps toward the darkening sky, while drums beat and conch shells sound and thousands of people, pilgrims and travelers, monks and merchants, stand shoulder to shoulder watching the flames reflected in the dark water. Downstream, funeral fires burn as they have burned without interruption for centuries, returning the dead to the sacred river. Upstream, children splash in the shallows, and boats drift slowly past. The past and the present exist here at the same time, not as a contradiction, but as a kind of continuity. And if you stand on these steps long enough, you begin to feel that you are standing not in one moment of history, but in all of them at once. This is the idea of India. Not a fixed thing, but a process. An ongoing conversation between the ancient and the modern, the sacred and the everyday, the individual and the collective, that has been going on for 5,000 years and shows no sign of ending. We have traveled a very long way together, you and I. We began more than 1 million years ago, with a stone tool dropped beside a river in what is now Tamil Nadu, evidence that thinking, shaping beings had walked this land long before anyone imagined. We stood in the ruins of the great Indus cities, marveling at their drains and their standardized bricks, and wondered why they fell silent. We listened to the Vedic hymns around a flickering fire on the plains of the Punjab, and followed the great Sikhs, the Buddha and Mahavira, as they walked the forests of the Gangetic Plain, asking questions about suffering and freedom that the world has never stopped asking. We watched Alexander's army refuse to march any further into a land that frightened even the bravest soldiers on earth. We saw Chandragupta build the first great empire, and his grandson Ashoka choose peace over conquest, carving his remorse and his ideals into stone pillars that still stand today. We traveled the Silk Road with Kushan merchants, and sailed the monsoon winds with Tamil traders carrying pepper and cotton to the ports of Rome. We marveled at the golden age of the Guptas, when Indian mathematicians invented the number system the entire world now uses, and Indian poets composed works of beauty that crossed oceans and centuries. We walked the great temples of the south, listened to the singing stone pillars, and watched Chola navies cross the open ocean to lands far beyond the horizon. We stood in the hill forts of the Rajputs and heard the approach of new forces from the northwest. We saw the Delhi Sultanate rise from the ashes of conquest, and the magnificent capital of the Vijayanagara Empire destroyed in a single terrible day. We heard the teachings of Guru Nanak and watched a community of the faithful forge itself through centuries of persecution into a tradition of courage and equality. We followed Babur across the mountains with his cannons and his poets and his extraordinary honesty, and watched his descendants build an empire of staggering beauty and wealth. We stood in the moonlight before the white marble tomb and felt the empire begin to crumble under the weight of its own contradiction. We rode with the Maratha cavalry through the passes of the Western Ghats and watched in sorrow as a commercial company from a distant island slowly turned the richest civilization on earth into a colonial possession. We heard the guns of 1857 and the silence that followed. We felt the weight of the famines and the railways, the exploitation and the education, the destruction and the slow awakening. We walked with Gandhi to the sea to pick up a handful of salt and stood in the midnight darkness as independence and partition arrived together, wrapped in joy and soaked in blood. We watched a new nation write its constitution, hold its first election, and begin the long, difficult, glorious work of governing itself. We saw wars and emergencies, assassinations and revivals, the opening of the economy, and the rise of a new India that could send a spacecraft to the moon. And through it all, through every invasion and every famine, every empire and every collapse, every act of cruelty and every flowering of beauty, the civilization endured. It changed, it adapted, it absorbed, it created, but it never stopped. The name India comes from an ancient word for the great river that flows through the northwest, a river that was already old when the first cities were built upon its banks. The idea behind that name, the sense of a shared civilization stretching across an enormous, impossibly diverse land, is both very old and always being made new. It was held together by pilgrimage routes that crisscrossed the subcontinent for thousands of years, by a sacred geography that gave people from every corner a sense of belonging to something larger, by languages and stories and trade routes that wove connections across every boundary. The modern idea of India, as a democratic, secular, and pluralistic nation, was forged in the struggle against colonialism. Different leaders imagined it differently. One saw a civilization whose genius lay in its capacity to absorb and blend diverse traditions without destroying them. Another saw a moral community rooted in village life and the dignity of labor. A third saw a constitutional republic where law and institutions would protect the weak against the tyranny of tradition. These visions were not always in harmony, but together they created a framework that has held one of the most diverse nations on earth together for more than 7 decades. The future holds immense promise and enormous challenge. Climate change threatens the monsoon that 1 billion people depend upon. Inequality persists. The tension between a secular constitution and rising religious nationalism tests the bonds of the republic. But India has faced existential challenges before, many times, and it has always found a way to continue. The evening ceremony of fire at Varanasi will go on long after the political arguments of this moment have faded into memory. The great river will continue to flow, the monsoon will come and go, and the people of this extraordinary land will continue to do what they have done for 5,000 years, to argue and create, to celebrate and mourn, to worship and build and reimagine themselves and their world. And now, As we come to the end of our long journey together, perhaps you are feeling the gentle pull of sleep. That is a good thing. You have traveled across more than 1,000,000 years tonight, from stone tools to spacecraft, from painted caves to marble palaces, from the banks of the Indus to the shores of the moon. Let the story settle into your mind like water settling into the earth, slowly, gently, carrying its treasures to a quiet place. The history of India is one of the greatest stories ever told, and it is far from over. But for now, rest. Close your eyes. Let the sound of the river carry you away. Good night.